Advertising is not art. It is not entertainment. And if someone looks at your marketing and calls it like creative, you have completely failed. Your only goal is to make them find it so interesting that they buy the product.
Yeah, it's an incredibly demanding standard to set right out of the gate. I mean, it completely strips away all the vanity that this entire industry has, built around itself over the last century.
Right. It fundamentally rewrites the definition of success in commercial communication. And that is exactly what we are exploring today. For this deep dive, we're examining the Overture, which is the opening manifesto of David Ogilvy's foundational text on advertising.
Yeah, and it's just a brilliant opening.
It really is. And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment. Whether you are scaling a startup or, managing a global brand, or simply trying to understand why certain messages move markets while others just vanish into the void, you are about to see why a vast majority of modern marketing focuses on the wrong variables. We're going to break down why understanding immutable human behavior, rather than chasing whatever the shiny new platform happens to be, is the ultimate architectural blueprint for business growth.
And to really understand the weight of that blueprint, we have to look at the architect. Because David Ogilvy he isn't just an academic theorizing from a distance.
Right, he was actually in the trenches.
Exactly. We are talking about a man who opened a modest creative boutique in New York back in 1949 and systematically engineered it into Ogilvy and Mather, which became one of the dominant advertising agencies on the planet. I mean, they had 140 offices spanning 40 countries.
Okay, let's unpack this because that level of global scale doesn't happen just because someone writes a few catchy slogans. You don't build an empire of that magnitude without an underlying operational philosophy that is, ruthlessly effective across different cultures, different economies, and different decades.
Yeah, you really don't. And his impact was so profound that in his later years, a prominent French magazine actually compiled a historical list of the individuals who had most significantly contributed to the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, and they placed David Ogilvy right alongside figures like Adam Smith, Thomas Edison, Karl Marx, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford, and John Maynard Keynes.
That is a staggering categorization. I mean, to be put next to Edison and Ford.
Right, and notably, he was the only person on that list who was still alive at the time of publication. They recognized that his methodology didn't just sell soap or cars, it literally standardized the mechanics of modern consumption.
Grouping him with Keynes and Edison suggests he built infrastructure, not just ad campaigns, but the actual psychological infrastructure of global commerce. And he lays out the foundational pillar of that infrastructure right in the opening pages, with what we can call the Demosthenes principle.
The Demosthenes principle is, without a doubt, the absolute bedrock of his entire worldview. It is the uncompromising stance that advertising is strictly a medium of information. It is not a canvas for self-expression or, avant-garde artistry.
It's functional.
Completely functional. And he illustrates this tension with a brilliant historical anecdote from ancient Greece, focusing on two rival orators, Aeschines and Demosthenes. Ogilvy notes that when Aeschines spoke, the crowds would stand, applaud, and say to one another, "How well he speaks."
So the audience was focused entirely on the performance. They were admiring the rhetorical technique, the cadence, the delivery.
Precisely. They were captivated by the artisan. But when Demosthenes spoke, the reaction was fundamentally different. The crowds did not compliment his speaking skills. They didn't stand around analyzing his syntax or his word choices.
What do they do?
Instead, they stood up and said, "Let us march against Philip."
Man, that completely flips the metric of success. It implies that applause is actually a symptom of failure, because the attention is on the speaker, not the objective.
It is the stark difference between validation and action. And this is the psychological trap that Ogilvy is warning us about. Human beings possess an incredibly seductive, innate desire to be Aeschines. Marketers, writers, designers, entrepreneurs, we all crave peer validation.
We want the applause.
Right. We want our industry colleagues to look at our output, give us prestigious awards, and validate us with that highly coveted label, creative. We want to be seen as intellectuals and artists.
I understand the theory, but let's pressure test this against modern brand strategy for a second. Surely there is tangible, long-term equity in a beautifully crafted, highly entertaining campaign.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah, I mean, if a piece of communication makes the consumer smile, if it becomes culturally relevant, doesn't that build brand affinity? I find it hard to believe that every single touch point needs to be purely, ruthlessly utilitarian. Doesn't pure direct response style marketing eventually erode the premium perception of a brand?
It is a phenomenal point of tension, and it is the exact debate that has fractured the advertising industry for decades. But Ogilvy's text is absolute on this matter. If your ultimate goal is to generate sales, and in the context of business, it invariably is, then entertainment is a dangerous, expensive distraction if it doesn't immediately ring the cash register.
So if they're laughing, they aren't buying.
He argues that if the consumer is complimenting the advertising, they are not buying the product. The cognitive focus has been entirely pulled away from the solution the product offers and redirected toward the cleverness of the brand offering it. You essentially create what industry veterans call a vampire effect.
A vampire effect.
Yeah, the entertainment sucks the lifeblood out of the core message. They remember the joke, but they forget the brand.
That makes perfect sense when you map it onto the B2B SaaS space today. I see companies spending massive portions of their Series B funding on highly abstract cinematic brand films. The cinematography is gorgeous, the voiceover is super philosophical, and it inevitably wins a B2B marketing award.
Exactly, that's ace schemes right there.
The CMO gets their validation. But a prospective enterprise client watches it and still has absolutely no idea how the software integrates with their legacy CRM or how it reduces their operational churn. They are left with a vague feeling of prestige, but zero actionable information.
What's fascinating here is how the ego of the creator actually becomes an active antagonist to the business. The abstract, cinematic brand film is ultimately built to serve the marketing director's portfolio and the agency's award cabinet. It is not built to serve the customer's need for clarity.
It's almost selfish.
It is completely selfish. And for you, the listener, the diagnostic test here is brutal but mandatory. You have to relentlessly evaluate your company's output by the specific action it inspires, not by the aesthetic compliments it receives.
So if they praise the launch but don't buy,
Then you failed. If you launch a new initiative and your industry peers say, wow, that was a beautifully executed launch, but your customer acquisition costs remain stagnant, Ogilvy would categorize that as a profound failure.
it requires an enormous amount of professional discipline to reject a compliment, doesn't it? To look at praise and say, this is the wrong kind of feedback.
It's very unnatural for us.
And if you are strictly optimizing for action over applause, it logically forces you to analyze what actually causes people to act. You stop looking sideways at what your peers are doing, and you start looking backward at historical data. Which brings us right into his battle between eternal verities and passing fads.
Yeah, and this is where his perspective becomes indispensable. He is writing this manifesto from the vantage point of old age and immense experience. He briefly wonders if his age disqualifies him from commenting on the modern advertising landscape.
But he quickly concludes the exact opposite.
Precisely. His longitudinal view of the industry allows him to separate what is an immutable law of human behavior from what is merely the illusion of newness.
The sheer confidence of his observation is striking. He states that since he opened his doors in 1949, he assumed he would witness several paradigm shifts in the industry. But looking back over decades, he claims there's only been one structural change: the emergence of television as a potent medium.
Right.
Everything else, he argues, has just been noise generated by pundits desperate for new labels.
He is aggressively dismissive of the industry's obsession with rebranding old concepts to sound revolutionary. He dismantles the arrogance of the present moment systematically.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He doesn't just make a broad philosophical claim. He names specific celebrated industry movements and essentially says, we already did this, you just gave it a new name.
Yes, he takes aim at the concept of brand images. In the marketing world, the pivot toward selling a brand image rather than just product features is heavily associated with the 1950s. And Ogilvy himself actually helped popularize the term in 1953.
But he doesn't take credit for inventing it.
No, not at all. He freely, almost casually, admits that the legendary direct response copywriter Claude Hopkins had outlined the exact same psychological framework 20 years earlier.
Oh, wow.
He then points to the famous creative revolution of the 1950s and 60s, a period historically credited to visionaries like Bill Bernbach. Ogilvy notes that this so-called revolution could just as easily be credited to agencies like N.W. Ayer and Young and Rubicam operating way back in the 1930s.
So the mechanics never changed.
The packaging changes, the terminology shifts, but the underlying mechanisms of persuasion remain entirely static.
So the error isn't necessarily in adopting new platforms or new terminologies. The error is in the arrogant assumption that a new platform requires a new psychology.
Exactly.
He explicitly lists the drivers that actually make consumers buy across all borders and all eras. He notes that people purchase products whose advertising promises them value for money, beauty, nutrition, relief from suffering, and social status. That is the fundamental source code of human commerce.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Ogilvy is outlining a thesis on evolutionary psychology applied to capitalism. Technology changes exponentially, but human neurology changes at a glacial pace.
It's so true. We still have the same brains as our ancestors.
Right. The medium we use to transmit the promise will constantly evolve, from broadsheet newspapers to radio to television, and into our current landscape of algorithmic social media and spatial computing. But the human being processing that transmission is driven by the exact same evolutionary imperatives that drove their ancestors a century ago.
They still want the same things.
They are biologically wired to avoid pain, to secure their social hierarchy, to seek health, and to ensure they aren't being cheated out of their resources.
It is a massive relief, honestly, because the modern executive is constantly bombarded with pressure to master the newest platform. First, it was the pivot to mobile, then it was voice search, then Web3 and the metaverse, and now it is AI-driven predictive engagement.
It's exhausting.
It really is. It induces a kind of operational paralysis. But Ogilvy is saying that while the delivery mechanism might transition from a printed page to an AI chatbot, the psychological triggers say a CFO's desire for relief from the suffering of an inefficient supply chain remains exactly the same.
And that is the ultimate practical takeaway for the listener. You have to give yourself permission to decouple your strategy from the frantic pace of technological fads. You do not need to panic if you haven't mastered the absolute latest digital buzzword.
Focus on the fundamentals.
Your primary responsibility is to master the eternal verities. Ask yourself, does my communication clearly promise value? Does it offer genuine relief from a specific suffering? Does it confer an elevated social status? If you secure the eternal verity, the platform you use to deliver it becomes an administrative detail, not the core strategy.
I follow the logic entirely, but looking at it from the client side, I hit a wall.
Okay, what is it?
Well, if the eternal verities are universally true, and if the Demosthenes principle of optimizing for action is so blatantly obvious, why is there an ocean of ineffective marketing out there? CEOs are, by and large, highly rational, data-driven people. Why would a rational executive approve a multi-million-dollar campaign that ignores these historical truths?
This is where Ogilvy transitions from philosopher to an absolute provocateur. He addresses this paradox by launching a blistering critique of what he calls the lunatic fringe of the advertising and marketing world.
Yeah, his language is incredibly sharp. He refers to them as idiots and noisy lunatics.
Yeah.
He describes a specific archetype of professional who will loudly denounce any technique that has been in use for more than 2 years as obsolete.
They just throw out what works because it's old.
Exactly. They actively mock historically proven frameworks, things like slice-of-life narratives, straightforward product demonstrations, or even a simple talking head explaining a clear benefit. They view these techniques as beneath them, completely ignoring the empirical reality that these boring techniques consistently move product.
This raises an important question, which is exactly the wall you just hit. How do these individuals survive, let alone thrive, in a ruthless capitalist ecosystem? If their avant-garde methods aren't generating revenue, why haven't they been eradicated by market forces?
Right. How do they keep getting hired?
Ogilvy has a very precise sociological diagnosis for this. He argues that their primary product is not actually salesmanship. Their product is eccentricity. They trade in obscure cultural references, bizarre art direction, and an arrogant, almost performative contempt for empirical research.
It's all smoke and mirrors.
They maintain their positions not by producing measurable results, but by bamboozling their clients with high-minded intellectual rhetoric.
He also highlights a fascinating geographical and cultural divide in how these professionals operate. He notes that this lunatic fringe finds massive favor at elite cocktail parties in cities like New York and London. They're celebrated by the cultural intelligentsia as visionaries.
But then they go to the Midwest.
Yeah. He points out that their theories evaporate when subjected to the hard sales, direct response environments of places like Chicago. It is the ultimate triumph of aesthetic style over commercial substance.
Exactly. And to answer your question about why rational CEOs fall for this, we have to look back at the A-skins trap. But this time, from the buyer's perspective, the executives themselves get seduced.
How so?
Well, put yourself in the shoes of a CEO who has spent 20 years agonizing over logistics, supply chain optimization, and quarterly margin spreadsheets. It's dry, difficult work. Suddenly, a charismatic, eccentric creative director enters the boardroom. This director doesn't talk about profit margins. They talk about shifting culture, about starting movements, about winning prestigious awards in Cannes.
They're selling a fantasy.
Yes, they treat the CEO not as a corporate manager, but as a modern-day Medici, a patron of the fine arts.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. It is an ego play.
It is entirely an ego play. The flattery is intoxicating. The executive becomes blinded by the desire to be associated with genius and edge. They want to go to those New York cocktail parties and be recognized as a cultural tastemaker. And in that intoxicating process, they completely lose sight of the objective, which is the cash register. They fund an art project under the guise of an operational expense.
It is the corporate equivalent of hiring an avant-garde architect to design a hospital, and the architect prioritizes sweeping, asymmetrical glass aesthetics over the functional layout of the emergency room.
That's a perfect analogy.
It wins Architectural Digest awards, but the nurses can't efficiently move gurneys from the ambulance bay to the operating theater. The aesthetic vision actively sabotages the utility of the building.
That is the precise danger Ogilvy is warning against. He is telling you to ruthlessly guard your organization against anyone, be it an external agency, a consultant, or an internal hire, who views your company's budget as a subsidy for their personal portfolio.
Protect the bottom line.
The takeaway here is to demand empirical accountability. Do not allow yourself to be charmed by complex industry jargon or promises of cultural relevance if they cannot map that back to a measurable action. If a vendor dismisses a proven historical framework simply because it lacks edge, you must recognize that they are optimizing for their own applause, not your survival.
So if we are systematically excising the lunatic fringe from our operations, we need a reliable framework to replace them. We need an intellectual anchor to ensure we are actually driving that Demosthenes-level action without reverting to guesswork. And Ogilvy argues that this anchor is the rigorous application of the scientific method to consumer behavior.
Yes, and this is where you really see Ogilvy's foundational respect for research. He doesn't rely on gut instinct. He demands that commercial communication be built upon observed, shared discoveries.
But there is a fascinating semantic tension here. Because despite his reliance on data, he goes out of his way to state that he absolutely despises the word rules. He claims he isn't imposing rules on his agencies. He is simply reporting on how consumers naturally react to different stimuli based on the data.
Right, he's just observing reality.
And he provides some highly specific, almost mechanical examples of this. For instance, he points out that research indicates commercials featuring celebrities are actually below average when it comes to persuading people to purchase a product.
Which is completely counterintuitive to the modern playbook, isn't it? The immediate instinct of the lunatic fringe is to secure the biggest A-list celebrity they can afford, assuming the cultural halo will transfer to the product.
But the data says otherwise.
Ogilvy points to the data. The celebrity creates a massive vampire effect. The viewer remembers the actor, but the product becomes secondary.
Right. And he offers another example regarding print layout. Extensive research shows that if you print your copy using standard black text on a white background, significantly more people will actually read it than if you use reverse type, which is white text on a black background.
Seems like such a small detail.
But it isn't an artistic preference. It is a biological reality of how the human eye processes contrast and fatigue.
To contextualize why he views this kind of research as sacred, Ogilvy introduces an incredibly potent historical analogy regarding the medical profession. He tells the story of the Chamberlain family, a dynasty of obstetricians in England who operated across the 17th and 18th centuries.
Oh, the story is wild.
It really is. This family built a massively successful, highly lucrative medical practice because they boasted infant and maternal mortality rates that were vastly lower than any other physicians of their era.
Because they possessed a proprietary technological advantage.
Exactly. They had invented the obstetrical forceps. But instead of sharing this life-saving medical advancement with the broader scientific community, they treated it as a closely guarded trade secret to maintain their commercial monopoly.
Which is just ethically horrifying by today's standards.
Oh, absolutely. They literally carried the instrument into the delivery room in a gilded box and blindfolded the patients to ensure the design wasn't leaked. They hoarded the innovation.
Wait, they actually blindfolded the women in labor?
Literally blindfolded them. It wasn't until a highly inquisitive medical student eventually climbed onto the roof of their facility, peered down through a skylight, and observed the forceps in action that the secret was finally broken. Once it was exposed, it elevated the standard of care for the entire medical field.
And Ogilvy is drawing a direct parallel between the medical field's evolution and the advertising industry's maturity.
Yes, but he is deliberately positioning himself in opposition to the Chamberlain family's ethics. He notes that in the modern era, medical professionals do not hoard life-saving discoveries. They publish them in peer-reviewed journals so the entire discipline can advance.
So his research is his version of the forceps.
Yes, Ogilvy views his decades of exhaustive, expensive research, the data on celebrity efficacy, the biological realities of black text versus reverse type, as his forceps. By publishing this manifesto, he is refusing to keep the data a trade secret. He is democratizing the data so that the entire industry can operate with greater precision and less risk.
I love the historical parallel, but I have to challenge his semantics. He is incredibly resistant, almost philosophically opposed to the word rule. But if decades of empirical research prove unequivocally that white text on a black background suppresses readership, isn't that functionally a rule? Why is he so allergic to that specific terminology?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the distinction is profoundly epistemological. Using the word rule implies a static, unbreakable dogma dictated by an authority figure. It implies that the intellectual journey is over. So describing it as a stimulus response, which is the terminology he demands, acknowledges the scientific method. A rule is top-down compliance. A stimulus response is a bottom-up observation. It leaves room for nuance, for cultural evolution, and for continuous testing.
So it's about staying curious.
Exactly. Ogilvy doesn't want his copywriters and art directors blindly following mandates just because the founder said so. He wants them to cultivate a deep, humble respect for the data. He is demanding that the ego of the creator be subjugated to the reality of the consumer's reaction.
It is the ultimate expression of humility in business. You do not arrogantly dictate to the market how they should behave. You observe how they actually behave, and you calibrate your approach accordingly.
Yes, you let the market guide you.
It is the exact same philosophy that drives modern multivariate testing in software development today. If an engineering team is launching a new interface, they don't sit in a conference room and let the lead designer mandate the layout based on artistic intuition. They test variant A against variant B in front of live users, and they observe the data. The data makes the decision.
It's the exact same mechanism.
Ogilvy was essentially advocating for multivariate testing decades before the software existed to automate it.
Precisely. You formulate a hypothesis, you introduce the stimulus, you observe the response, and you scale the winner. The practical takeaway for anyone navigating the business landscape today is to base your strategic decisions on observed, researched consumer reactions.
Stop guessing.
Stop guessing entirely. If you have the capacity to test an assumption, you do not rely on executive gut feeling. Furthermore, you do not operate in a vacuum. You must leverage the shared data of your industry. Read the postmortems, analyze the case studies, and utilize the forceps that other practitioners have already discovered and published.
So, what does this all mean when we pull all of these disparate threads together, from ancient Greece to 18th century medicine to the boardrooms of Madison Avenue? What is the cohesive thesis of this overture?
The ultimate synthesis of this chapter is that true, effective business communication is a ruthlessly functional discipline. It is the antithesis of a vanity project. It requires marrying the cold, empirical precision of the scientific method, using the forceps of research to understand behavioral stimuli, with a singular, unwavering focus on generating a specific, measurable action.
You are constantly asking the crowd to march against Philip.
Yes, and to achieve this, you must actively reject the ego-driven temptations of the lunatic fringe, ignore the seductive applause of peer validation, and anchor your strategy deeply in the eternal verities of human nature. You speak to timeless evolutionary needs using methods proven by data, not methods dictated by fleeting cultural fads.
It is an incredibly grounding philosophy. It cuts through the paralyzing complexity of the modern digital landscape and leaves you with a stark, undeniable mandate. But as we bring this conversation to a close, recognizing that we now understand the deep theoretical philosophy of what makes communication effective, well, it leaves us with an urgent, tactical question.
It does.
How exactly does one go about producing that caliber of unstoppable, commercially viable work on a daily basis? How do you actually structure the words, the images, and the teams to execute this philosophy? which is exactly the mechanical reality that lies ahead as we dive deeper into the rest of the text.
It is the leap from understanding the physics of aerodynamics to actually constructing the airplane. And I will leave you, the listener, with one final diagnostic question to mull over as you return to your own work.
What's the question?
Look closely at the very last piece of professional communication you put out into the world. It might be a pitch deck for a Series A, an email marketing sequence, or even a simple product description. Be ruthlessly honest with yourself. When you hit send, were you secretly hoping that people would look at it and say, how clever? Or did you scientifically design it to make them march?
That is the only metric that matters. So the next time you are in a strategic review and the objective starts to blur and the room starts debating aesthetic vibes and artistic expression over functional clarity, remember that human nature hasn't changed. The data is available. The eternal verities remain constant. You just have to possess the professional courage to ignore the applause, pick up the forceps, and focus entirely on delivering the outcome. What if I told you that spending millions of dollars on a meticulously crafted, just visually stunning advertising campaign could actually cause people to buy less of your product?
I mean, it sounds like a total paradox.
Right.
Because we operate in this business culture that basically worships exposure. There's this deep-seated assumption that getting your name out there, regardless of how you do it, is always a net positive in sales.
Yeah, that's definitely the assumption. But the data tells a totally different, honestly terrifying story.
Oh, absolutely.
Look at this massive study they mention from a former head of market research at Ford. They took a completely clinical approach, right? They inserted car ads into every other copy of the Reader's Digest.
So a perfect split test.
Exactly. Half the readers saw the ads, half didn't. And at the end of the year, they measured the actual purchasing behavior of both groups.
And the results are just mind-blowing.
The people who had not been exposed to the advertising had actually bought more Fords than the ones who had.
Wow.
I mean, the advertisements didn't just fail to persuade, they actively unsold the cars.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
And to add another layer to this, if you look at the data from direct response tracking, it shows that one advertisement can sell the exact same product in the exact same space 19.5 times better than another.
Wait, 19.5 times? Not double.
Almost 20 tons the volume.
Yes.
Yes. Which perfectly establishes the stakes for what we're looking at today.
It really does.
There is this tacit, almost desperate conspiracy in the business world among clients and media networks and agencies to just pretend that all marketing works to some degree.
Right, because everyone in that ecosystem has a financial interest in keeping that myth alive.
Exactly. But the empirical evidence just destroys that myth.
Yeah.
Communicating poorly doesn't just waste your budget, it actively repels your audience.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into the archives of advertising legend David Ogilvy. We're specifically looking at his foundational text on persuasion and consumer psychology.
Yes, zeroing in on Chapter 2 of his landmark work, which is called How to Produce Advertising That Sells.
And our mission here is to extract the exact blueprint he used to build billions of dollars in brand equity. In the next hour, you are going to learn the battle-tested mechanics of creating messages that actually bypass human skepticism.
Messages that truly compel action.
Right. And this matters to you, the listener, because whether you're an entrepreneur trying to scale a startup or, a freelancer writing a pitch email, or even just an employee trying to convince your boss to adopt a new strategy,
Understanding how to truly move people is the ultimate superpower.
it really is. So we're stripping away the artifice today. We aren't looking at creativity just for the sake of entertainment.
And we certainly aren't looking at how to win industry awards. We are dissecting information as a tool for behavioral change.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to start, I want to challenge the Hollywood stereotype of how persuasion is engineered.
Oh, the Mad Men stereotype.
Yeah, exactly. You watch TV shows about the golden age of advertising, and you see these executives in tailored suits day drinking in some mid-century office.
Just waiting for a lightning bolt of inspiration to strike.
Right, so they can scribble a catchy slogan on a cocktail napkin, but the text argues that the very first step in producing a message that sells is nothing like that.
Not at all.
It's actually tedious, grueling homework. But why? If I'm hiring a creative genius, why do I want them buried in manuals? Isn't that what the engineers are for?
Well, that is exactly the pushback that historically comes from the creative class. But the text is uncompromising here. If you don't study the product extensively yourself, you don't stand a tinker's chance of producing a successful campaign.
So you really have to get into the weeds.
Deep into the weeds. The danger of relying purely on your creative instinct without doing that grueling research is that you run the risk of skidding on what Ogilvy calls the slippery surface of irrelevant brilliance.
I love that phrase so much, the slippery surface of irrelevant brilliance. Because I think we've all seen that happen.
Oh, constantly.
You see a commercial that's beautifully shot, it's incredibly funny, maybe it has a massive celebrity cameo. You laugh, you share it with your friends.
But a week later, if someone asks you what product the commercial was actually for, you have absolutely no idea.
Yes, you remember the joke, but not the brand.
Precisely. You were entertained, but you weren't persuaded. Irrelevant brilliance might be aesthetically pleasing, but if it doesn't connect the actual mechanics of the product to the tangible needs of the consumer, it's useless.
From a business perspective, it's a total failure.
Exactly. So to avoid that slippery surface, the homework process must be incredibly rigid. You have to study the product deeply.
What else does the homework involve?
You also have to study the entire history of your competitors' advertising to understand the landscape. And you have to do primary consumer research to understand the precise vocabulary your target audience uses when they talk about their problems.
Even if that just means talking informally to half a dozen housewives, right? Like just regular end users.
Exactly. Get out of the office and listen to real people.
Okay, so if I actually force myself to do this grueling research, if I sit down with 300 pages of dry technical data, what am I even looking for? Am I just hunting for a cool-sounding buzzword?
No, you are looking for a unique, verifiable fact that the consumer actually cares about.
A verifiable fact.
Yes. The famous Rolls-Royce campaign is the ultimate case study here. When the agency got the account, they didn't just look at the vehicle and decide to write a poem about luxury.
Right.
The team spent 3 solid weeks doing nothing but reading dense engineering literature about the car's mechanics.
3 weeks.
3 weeks of dry, technical reading. And buried deep inside that highly technical material, they found a single sentence that became one of the most effective headlines in history.
And what was the headline?
At 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in this new Rolls-Royce comes from the electric clock.
Oh, it's just so specific. It doesn't say the most luxurious ride in the world.
No, because that's vague and easily dismissed.
Right. It gives you a physical speed, 60 miles an hour, and a specific sensory detail, the electric clock. It forces your brain to literally imagine the silence of the cabin.
It does. And notice what followed that headline. It wasn't just a beautiful photograph of the car winding through the Swiss Alps with a tiny logo.
No.
No, the advertisement contained 607 words of dense, factual copy.
607 words.
Yes. It was an essay on the engineering of the suspension, the tuning of the engine, the exact materials used in the interior.
But wait, doesn't conventional wisdom say that consumer attention spans are incredibly short?
That's what everyone says, yes.
So if I drop a 600-word essay on someone, aren't they just going to flip the page?
See, that is the great myth of modern marketing. Consumers do have short attention spans for things they don't care about.
Right.
But if you are asking someone to part with tens of thousands of dollars, their attention span suddenly becomes very long.
That makes total sense. They want to be absolutely sure.
Exactly. And this strategy wasn't a fluke. When the same agency later secured the Mercedes account in the United States, they didn't rely on generic tropes about German engineering.
What did they do?
They sent a dedicated team to the Daimler-Benz headquarters in Stuttgart. For 3 weeks, they did nothing but tape record extensive interviews with the actual engineers who built the cars.
That is dedication.
They extracted the raw, unvarnished data of why the axle was designed a certain way or why the brakes utilized a specific alloy. And from that agonizingly detailed research, they built a campaign entirely out of long, factual advertisements.
And what was the result of giving the American public all those dry engineering facts?
Mercedes sales in the United States jumped from 10,000 cars a year to 40,000.
Wait, they quadrupled the sales?
Yeah.
Just by treating the consumer like an adult who can process information?
They quadrupled the sales.
That makes me think about how we buy technology today. You know, if I'm going to spend $1,000 on a new smartphone, I don't want a billboard that just says it's magical.
No, you want the specs.
Exactly. I want to know the exact megapixel count of the camera, the exact battery capacity in milliamp hours. I want the architecture of the processor. I want facts to justify my emotional desire to buy the phone.
That is the exact psychological mechanism at play. Why do facts sell better than clever slogans? It comes down to trust and the mitigation of risk.
Because consumers are skeptical.
Highly skeptical. When they are spending their hard-earned money, a flowery adjective feels like a salesman trying to pull one over on them. But a hard, verifiable fact, that feels like an anchor.
Right, it feels safe.
Yes, You cannot bore people into buying your product. You can only interest them in buying it. And specific information is inherently interesting.
Give me an example of that.
Take the good luck margarine story from the text. Initially, the writer assigned to the account genuinely believed that margarine was manufactured from coal.
Which sounds completely insane now.
Right. But clearly, there was a massive disconnect between the product and public perception at the time.
So what did he do?
He spent 10 days intensively reading about the actual manufacturing process of margarine. He learned exactly what oils were used, how it was churned, how it was flavored.
He actually did the homework.
He did. And by replacing his ignorance with facts, he was able to write an advertisement that dismantled the public's hesitation.
Wow.
He did the exact same thing with Shell gasoline. He initially assumed all gasoline was exactly the same.
I mean, a lot of people still assume that.
Sure. But a deep briefing with the chemists revealed that Shell included a specific chemical compound called platformate.
Platformate.
Yes, which demonstrably increased mileage. By explicitly naming that specific factual ingredient, Shell managed to reverse a devastating 7-year decline in their market share.
I want to dig into that psychological mechanism for a second because naming an ingredient like platformate is fascinating to me.
How so?
Let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that every other gasoline company also had a similar chemical in their fuel. But because Shell was the only one actually saying they had it, the consumer naturally assumes they're the only ones who actually do.
Oh, absolutely. It creates the illusion of exclusivity.
Right. By simply explaining your standard operating procedure or your standard ingredients before your competitors do, you claim ownership of that benefit in the consumer's mind.
That is a brilliant point. If you document the care and precision that goes into your product, the consumer assumes your competitors are cutting corners, simply because your competitors aren't talking about it.
So the practical takeaway for you listening right now is incredibly stark. How often do you try to pitch a project or sell a service before you truly understand the raw mechanics of how it works?
It's a massive trap.
It really is. You think you can charm your way through a presentation with a nice slide deck and some industry jargon, but the foundation of persuasion is knowledge. Do the homework. And if you don't have the budget to hire a massive research firm to run focus groups, the text explicitly advises doing it yourself. Go have informal, unscripted conversations with half a dozen actual end users.
Just listen to them.
Listen to the specific complaints they have. Listen to the exact adjectives they use to describe their frustrations. Find your electric clock. Find your platformate.
But, having a mountain of facts is only the first phase. Because once you have 300 pages of data, you face an entirely new problem.
Right, because if I just dump an encyclopedia of facts onto a billboard or into a cold email, people will be completely overwhelmed. The cognitive load is way too high.
Exactly.
So how do we filter that mountain of information into something that actually pierces the noise?
This is where we transition into the strategic heart of the text. The concept of positioning.
Okay, positioning.
Now, positioning is a term that gets thrown around in corporate seminars endlessly, right? It's often shrouded in these incredibly complex matrices and charts.
Lots of jargon.
So much jargon. But the text provides the most ruthlessly simple, effective definition you will ever find. Positioning is just two decisions: what the product does and who it is for.
What it does and who it is for. But, here is my pushback on that.
Let's hear.
As an entrepreneur, if I've spent 2 years building a product, I want everyone on earth to buy it. If I specifically define exactly who it is for, aren't I artificially shrinking my own market? Aren't I leaving money on the table by excluding people?
It is the ultimate paradox of commerce.
Really?
Yes. The fear of exclusion is exactly what creates generic, invisible brands. If you try to appeal to everyone, your message becomes so watered down, so utterly devoid of edge or specificity that you appeal to no one.
You just become white noise.
Exactly. You have to have the courage to draw a line in the sand. Let's look at how Dove soap was introduced.
Okay, Dove soap.
The manufacturers had a choice based on the chemical facts. Dove had excellent cleaning power. They could have positioned it as a heavy-duty detergent bar for men who work with their hands like mechanics or construction workers.
They could have sold it as the ultimate grease remover.
They absolutely could have. But they made a highly specific, exclusionary positioning choice instead. They decided Dove was a toilet bar, specifically for women with dry skin.
And the specific factual promise attached to that was Dove creams your skin while you bathe. Right. Because they highlighted the fact that it contained 1/4 cleansing cream.
Exactly. What it does,
Yeah.
it creams your skin. Who it is for? Women with dry skin. They completely abandoned the demographic of men with dirty hands.
But they just walked away from that money.
They left that money on the table. And by doing so, they created a positioning so fundamentally powerful and resonant that it is still generating billions of dollars decades later.
Wow.
Contrast this with SAB and Volkswagen, which are absolute masterclasses in how positioning can entirely change the destiny of a product.
Let's talk about SAB first, because SA had a major problem. They were trying to sell cars in Norway, but the car had absolutely zero measurable profile.
Okay.
It was just a generic metal box on wheels in a sea of other metal boxes.
Right. They had no inherent identity. So the agency looked at the engineering facts and made a choice. They positioned the SAB explicitly as a car built for Norwegian winters.
Very specific.
They aimed their messaging entirely at the reality of driving in snow and ice. And within 3 years, SIB was voted the best car for Norwegian winters. They claimed a specific, undeniable territory in the consumer's mind.
But the Volkswagen Beetle example is on a whole different level. I mean, this is where positioning crosses over into actual cultural commentary.
It truly is. You have to picture the American automobile market in the late 1950s and early 1960s.
It was all about Detroit.
Detroit was the absolute center of the universe. They were pumping out these massive, ostentatious, gas-guzzling land yachts.
Cars with giant sweeping tail fins and acres of chrome.
Yes, it was the peak of post-war conspicuous consumption. Your car was your status symbol. And into this hyper-macho, bigger is better market rolls this tiny, slow, funny-looking German car.
The text literally describes it as looking like an orthopedic boot.
An orthopedic boot. Now, if they had brought that car to a modern marketing firm, the firm would have panicked.
Oh, for sure. They would have tried to hide how small it was. They would have tried to photograph it from low angles to make it look aggressive.
They would have tried to compete on Detroit's terms.
Exactly.
And they would have been laughed out of the country. Because if you position a Beetle against a Cadillac for luxury, you lose. If you position it against a Mustang for speed, you lose.
You can't win that game.
No. So instead, the brilliant team at the Doyle Dane Burnback Agency realized they couldn't win the status game, so they changed the game entirely. They positioned the Beetle as a deliberate protest against the vulgarity of Detroit.
That is incredible. They didn't just sell a car, they sold a counterculture.
Exactly. Who is it for? It is for intelligent nonconformists who reject the flashy, superficial culture of the suburbs.
And what does it do?
It gets you from point A to point B economically, reliably, and without the bloated ego. They ran headlines like, "Think small." They turned the apparent weakness of the car size into a badge of intellectual superiority.
And the result?
Sales exploded to 500,000 cars a year.
Yeah.
They built an absolute cult following, not by being everything to everyone, but by being something very specific to a specific type of person.
I think Avis car rental is my absolute favorite application of this theory, though, because it's so aggressively self-deprecating.
Oh, the legendary We Try Harder campaign.
Right, because Hertz was the undisputed king of the rental car market. They were number one, and everyone knew it. Avis was struggling in second place.
They were losing money.
Yeah, so instead of running ads claiming they were the biggest or the best, which everyone would have known was a lie, Avis comes out with a campaign that says, when you're only number two, you try harder. Or else.
The radical honesty of that statement completely disarms the consumer skepticism.
It's brilliant. The ad copy essentially said, look, we are number two. We can't afford to be arrogant. We can't afford to give you dirty ashtrays or half-empty gas tanks because we are desperate for your business.
The line at our counter is shorter because we literally have fewer customers than Hertz.
We try harder because we have to.
If we analyze the psychology there, Avis weaponized their own vulnerability. By openly acknowledging their exact place in the market hierarchy, they gained immediate credibility.
It's so smart.
And by logically connecting their weakness, being smaller, to a massive consumer benefit, better customer service, they made life absolutely miserable for Hertz.
Because how does Hertz even respond to that?
They can't. They can't say, no, we try harder, because they are the fat, comfortable market leader. Avis boxed them into a corner purely through positioning.
This maps so perfectly onto our lives today. Think about positioning yourself on a resume or in a job interview or even on a dating profile. If your resume essentially says, I am good at everything, I have no weaknesses, I can do any job, a hiring manager throws it in the trash. It's unbelievable and it's boring.
Because nobody is good at everything.
Right. But if you have the courage to say, I am highly specialized in this one specific area, I am terrible at these other things, but if you need this specific problem solved, I am the exact person for the job, that radical honesty cuts through.
It absolutely does.
You have to be willing to repel the wrong people to deeply attract the right ones. If your positioning doesn't alienate someone, it is fundamentally too weak.
That is a perfect synthesis of the concept. You exclude to include.
I love that. You exclude to include.
Now, at this stage of the process, you have done the grueling homework to unearth the facts, and you have ruthlessly defined your positioning. You know what it does and who it is for. But what happens when you enter a market where your competitor has access to the exact same facts and has adopted the exact same position?
Right. What happens when the underlying product is virtually identical? If I'm selling bottled water and you're selling bottled water, the facts are the same, it's just water. At that point, logic starts to fail as a differentiator.
And that reality introduces the next critical pillar from the text, cultivating the brand image.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Because products, much like human beings, have personalities. And those personalities, more often than not, dictate their success or failure in the marketplace. A brand image isn't just a clever logo or a specific color palette.
It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. It is the complex symbol that is formed in the consumer's mind through every single point of contact. It is the name, the packaging, the price point, the style of the advertising, and the physical nature of the product itself.
The text makes a very strict rule about this. It argues that every single advertisement, every public-facing message over the lifespan of a company must be viewed as a long-term contribution to this brand image.
It's an investment.
Right. It's a slow accumulation of equity. And Ogilvy strongly advocates that you must give your product a first-class ticket, meaning an image of absolute quality. This is especially vital for products that the text categorizes as things people wear.
And wear, in this context, is a psychological metaphor.
Explain that.
It applies to products that are consumed publicly, where the brand name acts as a social signal to your peers. We're talking about automobiles, cigarettes, beer, luxury clothing.
Things people see you using.
Exactly. If your advertising looks cheap, if it relies on frantic discounts and tacky graphics, that cheapness will literally rub off on the product itself. And human beings are deeply social creatures. Nobody wants to be seen utilizing a shoddy product.
The social signaling totally outweighs the functional utility.
Without a doubt.
To prove how powerful this social signaling is, the text brings up what I call the whiskey test, and honestly, this completely shattered my understanding of consumer preference.
A great example.
When it comes to whiskey, say, Jack Daniels versus Old Grandad versus Old Tailor people are violently loyal to their specific brand. They will argue with you at a bar about why their whiskey is superior.
They will?
But why did they choose it? If you ask them, they'll tell you it's the taste. But is it really?
The stark reality is that it almost certainly is not the taste. Very few consumers have the physiological palate to blind taste 3 different bourbons and accurately identify them, let alone meticulously rank their flavor profiles.
Right, it's mostly in their head.
These 3 brands survive and thrive because they project completely different images which appeal to entirely different demographics.
You don't choose the brand, you choose the mirror. You choose the brand that reflects how you see yourself, or more accurately, how you wish to be seen by others.
Exactly. The brand image is quite literally 90% of what the distiller is actually selling.
Which is wild to think about.
Take Jack Daniels. They spent decades building an image of homespun, unpretentious honesty. They told stories about this slow, charcoal mellowing process in Lynchburg, Tennessee. They used black and white, documentary-style photography.
So when a consumer orders Jack Daniels,
They are buying that aura of authentic, rugged independence just as much, if not more, than they are buying the ethanol and water in the glass.
they are literally tasting the image. And if anyone doubts that the brain can overwrite the taste buds, the text references an incredible psychology experiment conducted at the University of California that proves it definitively.
Oh, the distilled water experiment.
Yeah.
It is a profound demonstration of the placebo effect in marketing.
It really is. So researchers bring a group of students into a lab and give them a glass of distilled water. Perfectly pure, odorless, tasteless distilled water.
Okay.
They tell the students, this is distilled water. Drink it and tell us what it tastes like. The students drink it and say it tastes like nothing.
Which is physiologically accurate.
Right. But then, the researchers bring in a second group. They pour the exact same distilled water from the exact same pitcher. But this time, they tell the students, We want you to taste this tap water.
And the physiological response completely flips. Suddenly, the students contort their faces. They claim the water tastes horrible.
Why? It's the exact same water.
Because the mere mention of the word tap acted as a trigger. It instantly conjured an involuntary image in the students' minds. An image of municipal treatment plants, rusty pipes, and chlorine.
Oh, wow.
Their brains retrieved the memory of bad tap water and literally overlaid that hallucinated flavor onto their physical taste buds.
Yeah.
Their perception of reality was entirely dictated by the image they were preloaded with.
That is terrifying and brilliant at the same time. It means you can give someone a sip of cheap whiskey, tell them it's the cheap stuff, and their brain will actually experience harshness.
Yes.
You can take the exact same liquid, pour it from a premium crystal decanter, tell them it's a 20-year-old reserve, and their brain will hallucinate smoothness and complexity.
This is the definitive reason why rational, fact-based arguments alone cannot win long-term brand loyalty for parody products. Think about the cola wars.
Coke versus Pepsi.
Right, you don't catch Coca-Cola running aggressive television commercials claiming that Coke contains 50% more high-fructose corn syrup than Pepsi. That would be absurd.
Yeah, nobody wants to hear that.
They don't attempt to rationally argue you into choosing their beverage based on molecular superiority.
No, they sell Santa Claus. They sell polar bears. They sell teenagers laughing on a beach at sunset. They sell happiness, nostalgia, and Americana.
They sell an intangible emotion. And perhaps the most legendary, culturally dominant example of pure image building in the history of capitalism is the Marlboro Cowboy.
Oh, absolutely. This was Leo Burnett's masterpiece. People forget that before the cowboy, Marlboro was a struggling, relatively obscure brand.
It was actually initially marketed as a women's cigarette, right?
Yeah, with a red tip to hide lipstick stains, it was totally failing.
So Leo Burnett steps in and radically overhauls the entire image. He doesn't change the tobacco, he changes the psychology.
They launch a campaign featuring a rugged, solitary cowboy traversing the harsh American wilderness. The copy was minimal. Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro country.
Brilliant.
And here's the crazy part. They ran that exact same thematic campaign with very little deviation for 25 years. It took a failing, obscure brand and propelled it to become the biggest selling cigarette in the entire world.
Purely through image.
Entirely through the relentless projection of an irresistible image of rugged, independent masculinity. Men weren't smoking the tobacco, they were smoking the cowboy.
What is truly remarkable about the Marlboro story is not just the creation of the image, but the draconian discipline required to maintain it for a quarter of a century. The text emphasizes how exceptionally rare and difficult it is to sustain a consistent brand image year after year.
Because there are constant internal forces attempting to sabotage it. Because people get bored. A company brings in a new chief marketing officer, or they hire a hot new agency. The new team looks at the cowboy and says, "This is old. We didn't invent this. We need to make our mark. Let's do something with astronauts or rock stars."
They want to change the campaign simply for the ego-driven sake of change.
Right.
But if you have achieved a first-class ticket, if you have carved out a distinctive, profitable image in the consumer's mind, changing it arbitrarily destroys decades of built-up psychological equity. It is corporate vandalism.
So let's translate this to the modern listener. You must protect the personality of your brand or your own professional reputation with ruthless paranoia. Every single touch point matters.
It all contributes to the image.
If you are a high-end consultant charging premium rates, but you send emails riddled with typos from a generic Gmail address, or your presentation slides look like they were made in 1998, that cheapness rubs off on your intellect.
You're ruining your own first-class ticket.
You are forcing your clients to taste the rusty tap water of your presentation before they ever experience the distilled purity of your actual advice. Your image must be an airtight container for your value.
That is a highly practical application. So let's review our architecture so far. We have the foundational facts gathered through tedious homework.
Check.
We have the precise targeting of our positioning. And we have the protective, persuasive aura of the brand image. But even with all of that perfectly aligned, the text warns that your message can still fail entirely.
Wait, how is that possible? If I have the facts, the audience, and the personality, shouldn't success be mathematically guaranteed?
No, because we do not operate in a vacuum. We operate in a chaotic, hypersaturated environment. The text notes that unless you have a specific vehicle to catch the consumer's eye, your perfect positioning and pristine image will just pass like a ship in the night.
Nobody will even notice it amidst the noise.
Exactly. Which brings us to the elusive, almost mystical concept of the big idea. The text states that you can do homework from now until doomsday. But unless you invent a big idea to capture the public's imagination, you will never win fame and fortune.
And big ideas are agonizingly rare.
Very rare. David Ogilvy himself, widely considered one of the greatest persuasive minds of the 20th century, openly admitted that in his entire decades-long career, he probably didn't have more than 20 true big ideas.
That's crazy to think about. To 20 ideas in a whole career.
But what is truly fascinating is the psychological method he prescribes for finding them.
Because it's not what you think. You don't find a big idea by staring harder at a spreadsheet or locking yourself in a conference room with a whiteboard.
The foundational premise is that big ideas do not originate in your conscious, rational, calculating brain. They originate in the unconscious mind.
Like in a dream state.
Right. We see this pattern consistently throughout history, in scientific breakthroughs, in musical composition, and in strategic persuasion. The conscious mind analyzes. The unconscious mind synthesizes. But, and this is the absolute critical caveat that most people miss, your unconscious mind must be rigorously preloaded first.
You can't just expect your unconscious to pull genius out of thin air. You have to stuff your conscious mind to the absolute brim with raw information.
Exactly.
That is the entire point of the homework phase we discussed earlier. You read the 607 words on the Rolls-Royce suspension. You listened to 3 weeks of German engineers talking about brake pads. You pack the filing cabinets of your brain.
Gather all the pieces.
But once they are full, you have to deliberately unhook your rational thought process. You have to walk away from the desk.
You go for a long, aimless walk. You take a hot bath. Ogilvy famously suggested drinking half a pint of claret.
Which is very Mad Men of him.
It is. But you engage in an activity that occupies the conscious mind just enough to let its guard down, which opens the telephone line to the unconscious. Neuroscientists today refer to this as activating the default mode network in the brain.
Oh, the default mode network. I've heard of that.
Yes, it is the state where your brain begins making nonlinear connections between seemingly unrelated data points, and suddenly a fully formed idea wells up.
I absolutely love the Pepperidge Farm anecdote for this. The agency had all the facts about the quality of the bread, the ingredients, the baking process, but the big idea didn't come from a focus group.
Where did it come from?
It came to the writer in a literal dream. He dreamt about an old rustic baker driving a horse-drawn wagon along a quiet country lane on his way to personally deliver the fresh bread.
A powerful image.
That image, the horse and the wagon, became the visual anchor for their television commercials for the next 25 years. It instantly communicated tradition, care, and quality. It wasn't logically deduced. It bubbled up from an unconscious that had been prepared by facts.
We see this with other superstar big ideas as well. Consider the Hathaway shirt campaign.
Remind me of that one.
It was a perfectly fine dress shirt, but there was nothing wildly unique about the fabric. The big idea was simply putting a black eye patch on the distinguished older gentleman modeling the shirt.
Just an eye patch.
Just placing that eye patch created an instant aura of mystery. Who is this man? Is he a spy? An aristocrat? It gave the brand an incredible story appeal, and the campaign ran successfully for years.
Just from one visual tweak.
Or consider the early American Express Do You Know Me campaign, which featured names you knew but faces you didn't. These are not logical arguments. They are leaps of imagination that act as a lightning rod, drawing attention directly to the brand's positioning.
But, I want to represent the listener here who might be feeling a little panicked right now.
What's the concern?
What if I don't have a magical dream about a horse and wagon? What if I'm not selling a luxury car or a mysterious spy shirt? What if my product or my service is just normal? I'm an accountant, or I sell standard enterprise software. Am I doomed because I can't claim I have the absolute best, most revolutionary thing in the world?
Not at all. And this is where the text introduces a concept that acts as a profound relief valve for that exact anxiety. It is the concept of the positively good.
The positively good. I love this because it completely flips the pressure of marketing.
Historically, the advertising industry operated under the assumption that to persuade someone to buy your goods, you had to ruthlessly, aggressively convince them that your product was vastly superior to every single competitor on the market.
You had to claim it washed clothes whiter or tasted better or made you instantly wealthy.
Right, But with parity products, where the functional differences are negligible to the average user making hyperbolic claims of absolute superiority borders on the ridiculous. Consumers aren't stupid. They see right through the exaggeration, and it destroys your credibility.
It's the world's best cup of coffee paradox. Every diner in the world has a sign that says world's best coffee. Nobody believes it. It's white noise. So if you can't scream that you're the absolute best, what do you do?
The text argues that it is often entirely sufficient and vastly more effective to simply convince the consumer that your product is positively good.
Just positively good.
You don't have to insult their intelligence by claiming your soap is a miraculous scientific breakthrough. You just have to do an outstanding, clear, articulate job of creating confidence that your product is a very solid, reliable, high-quality choice.
That takes so much pressure off.
If you combine that calm confidence with a clear, factual explanation of how it works, your homework consumers will reward you with their business.
It's the power of reasonable expectations. Imagine you are at a crowded networking event. Everyone around you is screaming, waving their arms, claiming they can 10x your business overnight and revolutionize your life.
Which is exhausting.
So exhausting. And then one person steps up calmly, shakes your hand, and says, "Look, I don't have a magic wand, but I run a really solid, reliable accounting firm. Here is exactly our process. Here is how we ensure accuracy. And here is why our current clients trust us. We do positively good work."
I would hire that person immediately.
Exactly. In a sea of hyperbole, that quiet, factual honesty becomes your most aggressive, competitive edge.
It builds immense trust. Nobody can fault you for putting your best foot forward in a clear, rational, unexaggerated way.
So the takeaway for our listeners on this front is twofold. First, stop trying to force creativity through sheer willpower. You cannot squeeze a big idea out of a blank piece of paper if you haven't done the heavy lifting of research first.
Feed your brain the raw data.
Yes. And then give it the physical and mental space to naturally connect the dots. Take the walk. And second, release the pressure to be the absolute, undisputed best in the world at whatever you do. Often, just clearly, confidently, and honestly explaining that you are positively good is more than enough to win the trust of the market.
Which leads us to a vital, structural question about the life cycle of persuasion. Let us assume the absolute best-case scenario. You do the grueling homework, you nail the positioning, you establish a first-class brand image.
And your well-fed unconscious hands you a brilliant, big idea.
Right. You launch the campaign, and it works flawlessly. The sales curve stops going down and starts going up. You are a hero. What do you do next?
Well, say a year goes by, my boss calls me into the office and says, "The campaign was great, but it's getting a bit stale. We need a refresh for the new fiscal year." I should probably refresh it, right? I need to show I'm still adding value.
The answer from the text is incredibly simple, yet it is almost universally ignored by the corporate world. You do absolutely nothing. You do not touch it. You repeat your
Wait,
win.
you just run the exact same thing again?
If you are lucky enough to write a good advertisement, you repeat it until it mathematically stops selling. Scores of brilliant, highly profitable campaigns have been violently discarded long before they lost their persuasive potency, simply because the people who created them got bored.
There is a profound metaphor in the text to explain why repeating winners works. It says you have to remember that you are not advertising to a stand-in army. You are advertising to a moving parade.
That is the absolute crux of consumer psychology. The readership or viewership of an advertisement does not significantly decline when it is run multiple times in the same magazine or on the same network.
But why wouldn't people tune it out?
Because the market is constantly churning and refreshing.
Let's play an original analogy to this. Think about the TikTok For You page algorithm. It is a literal moving parade. If you post a video, it doesn't just go to a static list of followers who stare at it forever.
It's constantly moving.
Right. The algorithm constantly tests it against new, fresh batches of eyeballs. If the video is persuasive, the algorithm keeps serving it to new people. The audience of people who need your product today is entirely different from the audience who needed it 6 months ago.
Precisely. The advertisement that successfully sold a refrigerator to a couple who got married last year will almost certainly be just as successful at selling a refrigerator to a couple getting married this year.
Because last year, that new couple didn't care about refrigerators.
They were blind to your ad. It was irrelevant to their lives. But today, they're in the market. The radar sweep finally hits them.
A good campaign is a radar sweep constantly hunting for new prospects as they cross the threshold of needing your product. If you have a radar dish that works perfectly and detects the target every single time, you don't turn it off and build a completely new radar dish just for the sake of being creative. You keep the sweep running.
But the compulsion to change winning campaigns is overwhelming. And it almost always stems from internal corporate fatigue, not external market fatigue.
Mhm.
The marketing executives see the ad every single day. The agency sees it every day. They assume the public must be as sick of it as they are.
The Henry Ford story perfectly illustrates the comedy of this error.
Oh, it's classic.
The text recounts Henry Ford calling his chief copywriter into his office. Ford is frustrated, and he complains, "Bill, that campaign of yours is dandy, but do we have to run it forever? I'm sick of looking at it."
And what does the copywriter say?
He looks at him and calmly replies, "Mr. Ford, the campaign has not yet appeared in the newspaper."
Unbelievable.
Ford had simply seen it too many times in internal pitch meetings. He was bored of it before the public had ever laid eyes on it.
It is hilarious, but it is tragically common. The only empirical way to settle the argument of when to change a campaign is to measure its actual selling effectiveness at regular intervals and go on running it until the hard data proves it is worn out.
And who understands this better than anyone else?
The direct response advertisers.
Yes. The text practically begs the reader to obsessively study direct response advertisers. These are the people soliciting orders directly by mail or through 1-800 numbers, or in today's world, through direct e-commerce click-throughs. Why does Ogilvy revere them as the ultimate authority?
Because direct responder advertisers have absolutely nowhere to hide. Think about general advertisers. The companies doing massive, vague brand campaigns on television or billboards. They operate in a fog of attribution.
What do you mean by fog of attribution?
If their sales go up or down at the end of the quarter, there are 100 different variables that could be responsible. Was it the economy? Was it the weather? Was it competitor pricing? They can easily hide their creative failures in the nebulous clouds of building brand awareness.
Ah, I see.
But direct response advertisers know exactly to the penny how much revenue each individual advertisement generates. It is the unforgiving acid test of persuasion.
It's binary. If an ad costs $10,000 to run in a magazine and the coupons that come back only generate $8,000 in sales, the ad is a failure. It is killed immediately.
Exactly.
If it generates $12,000, it is a success and it is repeated. There is no room for debate about whether the font was pretty.
There isn't. Direct response relies on the scientific method. They test everything. They test the headline, the price point, the guarantee, the length of the copy. And what you will inevitably notice if you study their techniques is that they never, ever sacrifice clarity for cleverness.
Never.
They use long, highly factual copy because they know it converts. They use strong, unmistakable promises. They do not use abstract, avant-garde designs that confuse the eye. They use techniques that empirically move the needle.
It's all about results.
The text notes a deeply ironic fact about Ogilvy's own career. He states that his most successful advertisement ever, the one that produced the most massive, tangible societal results, was a completely down-to-earth, dense, factual piece for industrial development in Puerto Rico.
I remember reading about that ad. It won absolutely 0 awards for creativity from the industry. It wasn't framed in any modern art museums.
No, it wasn't.
But it successfully persuaded scores of massive manufacturers to physically relocate their factories to a poverty-stricken island. It literally changed the geopolitical economy of Puerto Rico.
It did.
And yet, he notes with a hint of bitterness that an agency which produced nothing but that kind of highly effective, highly factual advertising would never win a reputation for being creative and would eventually lose all its clients and wither on the vine.
Which brings us to the fatal psychological flaw inside the advertising industry, and frankly, inside the ego of anyone who considers themselves a creative professional. It is the cult of creativity.
The cult of creativity.
There is a deep, intoxicating, fundamentally narcissistic desire for applause from your peers, which frequently overrides the professional obligation to actually achieve results for your client.
The text quotes the legendary ad man Rosser Reeves on this exact phenomenon, and it is a brutal reality check. He says, imagine you are a corporate executive. Your sales are plummeting. Your future depends on reversing this trend.
The pressure is on.
The livelihood of your thousands of employees depends on it. You walk into an advertising agency to hire them. What do you actually want from them? Do you want fine writing? Do you want avant-garde masterpieces that the copywriters can frame on their walls and show off at cocktail parties?
Or do you want to see the goddamn sales curve stop moving down and start moving up?
Exactly. If it doesn't sell, it isn't creative. That should be the foundational mantra for anyone engaged in business communication.
The pursuit of originality, purely for the sake of being original, is incredibly dangerous to your bottom line. Reeves calls originality an illusion, a swamp fire, an ignis fatuus that leads you into the mud.
It distracts you from what matters.
He points out that even Mozart, who is arguably the pinnacle of human musical genius, stated that he never made the slightest effort to compose anything original. True, lasting effectiveness comes from a deep, masterful understanding of the fundamentals, not from a desperate attempt to be edgy just to impress your peers.
So the ultimate practical takeaway for the listener here is a call for extreme discipline. You must prioritize the result over the applause. If you find a formula that works, whether it's an email outreach template that actually gets replies, a specific slide deck that consistently closes deals, or a digital marketing channel that converts at a high rate, you must swallow your ego and repeat it until the hard data tells you it has stopped working.
You have to trust the data.
Do not change your winning formula just because you are personally tired of looking at it. Remember, you are talking to a moving parade. Let the radar sweep.
If we synthesize this entire journey, we see that Chapter 2 fundamentally redefines what advertising, and by extension, any form of persuasive business communication actually is. It is a rejection of the Hollywood myth.
Completely.
It is not an art form. It is not entertainment. It is a highly specialized medium of information. The soul of this chapter is the realization that true persuasion demands an almost grueling level of homework to unearth the hidden facts.
It requires the courage to make precise, exclusionary positioning decisions.
Yes. And it requires the paranoia to protect a relentlessly consistent brand image. And above all, it requires an absolute, unyielding obsession with measurable results over artistic vanity.
It's about fundamentally respecting the consumer. It's about respecting them enough to give them the actual factual information they need to make an informed decision, rather than trying to dazzle them, trick them, or distract them with irrelevant brilliance.
Precisely. The mechanics of human psychology haven't changed. The results are entirely visible, provided you are brave enough to test them, measure them, and accept what the data tells you, even when it bruises your creative ego.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of persuasion. You now have the blueprint, from the grueling homework of the electric clock to the relentless repetition of the moving parade, to make your messages impossible to ignore and impossible to misunderstand.
It's a powerful toolkit.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We just spent an hour discussing Ogilvy's ironclad rule that you must relentlessly repeat a winning advertisement until it mathematically stops working. But how does that philosophical absolute hold up in today's era of hyper-accelerated algorithmic fatigue?
That's a great question.
We live in a digital ecosystem where platforms like Facebook and TikTok actively penalize and throttle repetitive content. An ad that might have run for 25 years in a magazine can now burn out an audience in 48 hours. So, are the platforms fundamentally fighting against human psychology? Or has human psychology actually adapted to the infinite scroll, meaning the rules of the moving parade are changing beneath our feet?
It's a fascinating tension.
That tension between timeless psychology and modern algorithms is something every marketer has to reckon with. We will continue exploring the chaotic, eccentric, and absolutely fascinating world of persuasive psychology next time. See you then. So, Cosimo de' Medici once lured a sculptor to his service by writing a letter that concluded with this rather intense promise. He said, "Come, I will choke you with gold."
Oh, wow. That is quite the pitch.
Right. And I mean, when people think about a career in advertising or, high-stakes marketing, that is very often the image that comes to mind.
Yeah, the massive payouts, the glamorous pitches in those glass boardrooms, just the sheer intoxicating wealth of it all.
Exactly. But then on the flip side, you have the legendary novelist Raymond Chandler, who looked at the exact same industry and described it in a completely different way. He called it an elaborate waste of human intelligence.
Man, it is a phenomenal contrast. I mean, we have this tension between extreme financial reward and the potential for deep soul-crushing meaninglessness.
Yeah.
And that tension is really the perfect lens for what we're exploring today. We're looking at the realities of a high-pressure creative industry where the truth usually sits, uncomfortably right in the middle of those two extremes.
Totally. So for this deep dive, we are pulling our insights strictly from Chapter 3 of David Ogilvy's absolute classic, Ogilvy on Advertising.
Yeah, specifically the chapter titled Jobs in Advertising and How to Get Them.
Right. And our mission today is to cut through the mythology. We're going to unpack the unjarnished truth about the different roles inside an ad agency, what it actually takes to land them, and why these timeless principles matter so deeply to you.
Because whether you are an entrepreneur, maybe someone trying to accelerate your corporate career, or just a student of human behavior, you are really going to find a roadmap here.
So to start off, we need to zoom out a bit, right? Before we can understand the specific jobs, the writers, the executives, the researchers, we really have to map the territory.
Yeah, we do. So Ogilvy identifies four distinct arenas, or I guess career paths, within the broader advertising world. First, you have media.
Okay.
And this means you are working for a television network, a magazine, or, today it would be a digital platform. And your entire job is basically selling the advertising time or space to other people.
So you're essentially the landlord renting out the billboards.
Exactly. That is a great way to think of it. The second path is retail. This is working directly for a massive brand. Ogilvy uses Sears Roebuck as his example.
Right, where you're handling their local or internal advertising day in and day out.
Yeah. And then the third path is manufacturing. So this is where you join a massive conglomerate like a Procter & Gamble and work as a brand manager.
Steering the ship for a specific product line from the inside.
Exactly. And finally, the fourth path, which is where Ogilvy focuses almost all of his attention, is the advertising agency itself.
Let's hover on that fourth path for a second, because Ogilvy describes the agency environment as a psychological hothouse.
He does, yeah.
And I want to understand the mechanics of that. Like, why a hothouse? Why isn't a massive manufacturing company like Procter & Gamble a hothouse too?
Well, the agency model is incredibly unique because it's a service business, completely dependent on the daily generation of new ideas. And it's all under extreme deadlines.
Ah, I see.
So a psychological hothouse implies an environment that is artificially heated, right? It's intensely pressurized, and it's designed to force rapid, sometimes unnatural growth.
Because you have dozens of different clients, hundreds of different problems, and that constant existential threat that a client could just walk out the door tomorrow.
Precisely. Ogilvy points out that in an agency, you will never, ever be bored. It is a continuous state of high-alert stimulation.
You know, it sounds a lot like doing a medical residency at a high-pressure teaching hospital.
Oh, that's a really good comparison.
Yeah, because you don't sign up for a surgical residency because you want a cozy 9-to-5 schedule and a massive paycheck on day one. You go because you want the intensive trial-by-fire learning curve.
Right.
You're surrounded by senior people who are forced to teach you while the patient is literally on the operating table.
And that teaching hospital mentality, that is the core mechanism of excellence in this industry. Ogilvy makes a really crucial point for anyone starting out. In this kind of hothouse environment, especially early in your career, what you learn is vastly more important than what you earn.
Right, earning comes later.
Exactly. And he actually noticed a very clear pattern regarding this hunger to learn. He says that in mature markets, agency employees often develop this fatal arrogance. They think they've figured it all out, so they have nothing left to learn.
Meanwhile, in emerging markets, I think he specifically highlighted Asia at the time of his writing, the professionals were incredibly hungry.
Oh, so hungry. They welcomed lecturers, they devoured case studies, they stayed late to study old campaigns. And because of that raw hunger, their standards of competence were rapidly outpacing the West.
So think about your own career for a second here. The practical takeaway is really about intentionally choosing your environment.
Yes, absolutely.
If you are navigating a career transition or just starting out, you should actively hunt for the hothouse. Prioritize the steep learning curve over the immediate, comfortable financial reward.
Because that hunger to absorb knowledge, that is what builds your undeniable value later on.
Okay, so once you are inside that hothouse, you start to see the distinct factions that make the ecosystem work. And the most fundamental group, the engine of the entire agency, is the creative department.
Yeah, the people actually making the advertisements, the art directors and the copywriters.
I found the history of the art directors super fascinating in the text. Ogilvy notes that they used to be considered just handmaidens to the copywriters.
Right. That's just such a crazy term to use.
It really is. They were basically human printers, just sketching whatever the writer told them to sketch. But that dynamic shifted dramatically, didn't it?
It did, yeah. And largely because the rise of television and highly visual print media, suddenly advertising transitioned into a fundamentally visual medium.
So the art directors rose in power.
Exactly. With many eventually becoming these formidable creative directors who run entire agencies. But even with the rise of the visual element, Ogilvy remains adamant about one thing.
What's that?
Copywriters are the most important people in the agency, period.
Yet they seem to be the least celebrated. I mean, there is a staggering statistic in the text. Out of 88 people elected to the Advertising Hall of Fame at that time, only 13 of them were copywriters.
It is a bizarre paradox. The people writing the actual words that persuade a human being to open their wallet, making the cash register ring, they get almost none of the historical glory.
So let's talk about the psychology of a truly great copywriter. Ogilvy outlines a specific profile, and it actually has very little to do with having a fancy vocabulary.
No, not at all. He says they need an obsessive curiosity about products, about people, and about the mechanics of advertising itself.
They must have a sense of humor, they have to think in pictures, and they need a relentless habit of hard work.
And this leads to one of the most powerful frameworks in the entire book. Ogilvy borrows a concept from William Maynard, who argued that most good copywriters fall into two distinct psychological categories: poets and killers.
Poets and killers, I love that.
Right, so a poet sees an advertisement as an end in itself. They want it to be beautiful, clever, avant-garde. They want it to be a piece of art that wins awards at festivals.
Okay, and the killer?
A killer, conversely, sees an advertisement solely as a tool, a means to an end. And that end is always, always sales.
Wait, I want to explore the tension there for a second. If I'm a copywriter and I'm a pure killer focused entirely on the transaction, wouldn't my work just devolve into those obnoxious, repetitive late-night infomercials?
Oh, for sure.
The ones that just scream ACTNW until the consumer just mutes the television. How does Ogilvy justify that approach?
Well, he doesn't advocate for being just a killer. A pure killer does risk becoming abrasive and easily ignored. Just as a pure poet risks creating a beautiful film that bankrupts the client because nobody actually knows what product is being sold.
Oh.
The magic, Ogilvy explains, lies in the synthesis of the two. He states very clearly, if you are both killer and poet, you get rich.
So you really need to marry those two sides.
Exactly. The masters of this industry do not compromise one trait for the other. They use the artistic sensibility, the humor, and the visual elegance of the poet to disarm the consumer and capture their attention.
And then once they have that attention, they use the strategic, benefit-driven, relentless logic of the killer to actually close the sale. So if you're listening to this and you're building a business or a personal brand, ask yourself where you lean. To be truly invaluable, you cannot just be a pure head-in-the-clouds creative.
No.
And you cannot be a soulless spreadsheet optimizer. You have to actively cultivate both. You need a deep artistic appreciation for your craft married to a ruthless focus on actual, measurable results.
So well said. Now let's look at what happens when that brilliant, perfectly balanced creative work hits the real world. Because a masterful ad campaign is completely useless if the client refuses to approve it.
Which brings us to the human shield of the agency, the account executive.
Yes, the diplomats standing directly in the crossfire between the eccentric creatives on one side and the anxious, bottom-line-driven corporate clients on the other.
It is an incredibly difficult psychological position to be in. When an agency makes a mistake, the client screams at the account executive.
Yeah.
And when the client is being stubborn or unreasonable about a brilliant idea, the agency's creative team blames the account executive.
They really can't win. Historically, this role used to be a true marketing partnership. They were the strategic minds guiding the client. But as corporate clients began hiring MBAs and building their own internal brand management teams, the account executive often found their role shrinking.
Ogilvy actually shares a pretty depressing story about eavesdropping on a plane.
Oh yeah, that one's rough.
He overhears an account executive complaining to a friend, essentially admitting he doesn't write the ads, he doesn't do the research, he doesn't bring in new clients, and he doesn't even do the marketing strategy anymore. He just coordinates meetings.
He was acting as a custodian instead of a contributor. And Ogilvy detested that passive mentality. He saw too many account executives acting like waiters, simply shuttling a plate of food between the chefs in the kitchen and the customers in the dining room.
Just taking orders and offering no original value.
Exactly.
So if they shouldn't be a waiter, what's the alternative? Should they be more like a master sommelier?
Man, that is a brilliant way to frame it. Think about it. A waiter just carries the bottle to the table. But a master sommelier, they have walked the vineyard.
Right.
They know the chemical composition of the soil. They know the weather patterns during the harvest. They understand the fermentation process on a granular level. When a sommelier recommends a pairing, you don't argue with them because their authority is absolute.
So how does an account executive actually build that level of absolute authority? Ogilvy gives a very specific, almost extreme prescription for this. He calls for radical immersion.
He really does.
He says if you are assigned to a client who sells gasoline, you don't just skim their marketing brief. You go to the library and read heavy textbooks on oil geology. You study the production of petroleum products.
You read the obscure trade journals?
Yes, and most importantly, you spend your Saturday mornings hanging out at local service stations, talking to actual motorists while they pump gas.
Can you imagine spending your weekend at a gas station just to understand the customer? But the mechanism here is about creating undeniable leverage through specialized knowledge.
Yeah.
Ogilvy promises that if you engage in this radical immersion by the end of your first year, you will know more about the client's business than your own boss does.
Which means you transition from being a disposable middleman to an indispensable strategic asset.
Exactly. And he also pairs this deep knowledge with a fascinating piece of negotiation advice for dealing with clients. He says you must fight for the kings, queens, and bishops, but throw away the pawns.
It's a lesson in strategic capital, isn't it? Because many account executives exhaust their clients by arguing over every single comma, every minor font choice, every trivial detail.
Yeah, they want to win every battle to prove their worth.
Right. But Ogilvy argues for a habit of graceful surrender on the small things.
Because if you can see the pawns cheerfully, you build a massive reservoir of goodwill. Then, when a critical strategic issue arises, a king or a queen, and you plant your flag and say, no, based on my deep knowledge of your industry, we must do it this way, the client actually listens.
So the takeaway for you is clear. No matter what industry you work in, radical immersion is your ultimate superpower. Learning the granular, unglamorous, dirty fingernails details of your industry gives you a foundation of authority that nobody can ignore.
Okay, so we've covered the creatives making the ideas and the executives selling them. But the hothouse has two other critical factions that generate an enormous amount of friction.
Ah, right. The people who measure the results and the people who bear the burden of holding the entire chaotic operation together.
The researchers and the management.
Let's look at the researchers first. Ogilvy has a very complicated relationship with them, which is almost contradictory considering he used to be a researcher himself working for Dr. Gallup.
Yeah, it's pretty ironic.
He deeply respects the function and demands absolute intellectual honesty from them. But he also unleashes a barrage of complaints about how they operate within the agency.
He does. He identifies a severe behavioral flaw in agency researchers. He calls them natural slowpokes.
Slowpokes?
Yeah, he points out the absurdity that in high-stakes political campaigns, managers can receive complex, highly accurate demographic reports just 18 hours after the polls close. But in an ad agency, the research department will take 3 months to answer a few basic consumer questions.
3 months? Why does that happen? Like, if they have the capability, why the 3-month delay?
Well, it goes back to the psychology of the hothouse. When the environment is defined by intense fear of losing a multi-million-dollar account, fear of being fired researchers become completely paralyzed by the need for absolute certainty.
They're terrified of making a mistake.
Exactly. So they hide behind endless methodological delays and months of data gathering as a protective mechanism. Plus, they also suffer from terrible institutional memory.
Right. Ogilvy notes they have a habit of losing old data, meaning 2 years later, when the team turns over, they end up reinventing the wheel and charging the client all over again.
But his absolute biggest grievance with researchers, and honestly, this is a recurring theme across all his writing, is their use of language. He despises pretentious corporate jargon.
Oh, he really does. He practically begs them to stop using phrases like attitudinal paradigms, demassification, and symbiotic linkage.
Because jargon is just another protective mechanism. It is a smokescreen of complexity designed to hide a fundamental lack of clear thought.
He actually quotes a real job application he received from a researcher, and it is a masterpiece of corporate word salad.
Oh, read it. It's so bad.
The applicant wrote that their objective was to obtain a position, quote, utilizing extensive experiences in marketing communications areas as a viable contribution to corporate objectives, end quote.
What does that even mean?
It means absolutely nothing. It is an empty suit made of words.
Seriously.
And think about your own inbox today. I mean, how many emails have you received that sound exactly like that? The lesson here is timeless. Plain, direct language always wins.
Always.
Whether you are conducting elite data analysis for a Fortune 500 company or just writing a cover letter to get an entry-level job, Drop the pretentious jargon. Speak like a human being.
Well, and that need for clarity and emotional intelligence brings us to the very top of the agency pyramid, the chief executive officer and the creative director.
Right.
If you thought the account executive had a tough diplomatic job, the sheer physical stamina, resilience, and psychological fortitude required to run an agency are just staggering.
Is management in this industry essentially just high-stakes babysitting for fragile egos?
Honestly, it is a massive component of the job. Ogilvy is remarkably blunt about the toll it takes. A CEO, in this environment, is essentially a leader of frightened people.
Right, because everyone in the hothouse is vibrating with anxiety.
Exactly. The copywriter is terrified of the blank page and worried they won't have a genius idea by Tuesday. The account executive is terrified the client is going to fire the agency over a bad quarter.
And CEO has to absorb and manage all of that collective fear, while simultaneously working 12-hour days, constantly entertaining clients, and spending half their life sleeping in hotel rooms.
And the physical toll is terrifying.
Yeah.
He drops a deeply sobering statistic. The death rate from stress-related causes is 14% higher among senior advertising executives than their counterparts in other white-collar occupations.
Wow. 14%.
Yeah, the human cost is very real. He shares a quote from Albert Lasker, who was one of the foundational giants of the advertising industry. Lasker was talking about the sheer emotional exhaustion of managing copywriters.
What did he say?
He confessed, "You think managing copywriters is a snap? You have taken some hairs out of me. I had a breakdown that kept me 5.5 months. I couldn't talk for 5 minutes without starting to weep."
Oh, wow. That completely strips away the glossy, romanticized Mad Men image, doesn't it?
It really does.
It proves why Ogilvy says the number one attribute you need to be a successful creative director isn't actually creative genius. It is being a good psychologist.
Yeah.
You have to be slow to quarrel, eager to share credit, willing to accept the blame when things go wrong, and somehow, through all the pressure, remain full of infectious joy to keep the team motivated.
And sustaining that over a decades-long career requires a remarkable human being.
Hmm.
This is why Ogilvy places such a massive emphasis on culture. He warns fiercely against toxic behaviors like the NIH syndrome.
Not invented here.
Right, where insecure leaders reject brilliant ideas simply because they didn't come up with them. The core job of management is to construct a psychological safety net so that highly sensitive talent can flourish without destroying themselves or the business.
So we have journeyed through the entire ecosystem. We've explored the artificially heated hothouse, the tension between the artistic poets and the ruthless killers, the master sommelier approach to account management, the jargon-hiding researchers, and the psychologically battered leadership.
It's a lot.
It is. How do we tie all these disparate roles into a single cohesive philosophy for the listener?
Well, if you look at the underlying DNA of this chapter, it all points to a singular, memorable insight. A truly successful career in a high-stakes creative industry requires a very rare, paradoxical blend of traits.
Okay.
You need the obsessive, wide-ranging curiosity and empathy of the poet, inextricably bound to the extreme, specialized, and highly resilient hard work of the killer.
And Ogilvy is brutally honest that this combination is not for everyone.
No, definitely not.
He actually tells a story about a former partner of his who was a brilliant mind, a superb naturalist, but who secretly despised every single day he spent inside the agency. Ogilvy actually sat him down and advised him to quit. And the partner left the industry entirely to go save endangered species of fauna from extinction and was infinitely happier.
Which is amazing. Ogilvy quotes an old Scottish proverb to justify this advice. He says, "Be happy while you're living, for you're a long time dead."
His ultimate conclusion is essentially a warning, right? Do not get a job in advertising or any high-pressure field unless it interests you more than anything else in the world.
Because if you do not possess an intrinsic love for the mechanics of the work itself, the heat of the hothouse will simply burn you to ash. But if you do love it, and if you are willing to immerse yourself in the dirt of the vineyard, the leverage you can build is limitless.
Now that you understand exactly who populates the agency, what their psychological profiles are, and what it takes to survive the hothouse, it raises an enormous operational question.
What's that?
How do you actually run this chaotic, ego-driven machine on a daily basis without losing your mind? I mean, how do you keep the creatives from turning on the executives and the clients from firing everyone?
Well, that is exactly what we will explore in the next chapter. It requires an entirely different set of operational mechanics and leadership philosophies.
But before we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. There is a small moment in the text where Ogilvy complains about a trend he was noticing. He says that modern workers are becoming increasingly nomadic.
Yes.
He mentions reviewing a resume for a 40-year-old copywriter who had already held 11 different jobs, and Ogilvy views this extreme transience as a severe negative.
Because constant movement shatters the continuity of deep institutional knowledge.
Exactly. So think about how that applies today in our current hyper-transient gig economy. The average tenure at a job is shrinking every year. People are constantly jumping from company to company for a slight bump in title or a small increase in pay.
Right.
So ask yourself, does changing jobs constantly make it fundamentally harder or even impossible to achieve the kind of radical immersion that Ogilvy insists is the ultimate key to leverage?
It's a great question. By constantly moving, are we trading deep, indispensable expertise for shallow, easily replaceable mobility?
It's a profound question about the architecture of a modern career and whether true mastery requires a level of patience we are culturally losing.
Definitely something to think about.
Something to chew on as you evaluate your own path.
Mhm.
Are you putting yourself in an environment where someone will gladly choke you with gold for your deep, irreplaceable expertise? Or are you simply engaging in an elaborate waste of your own human intelligence? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.
Did you know that the people crafting the most brilliant, confident advertisements you see every day, the ones that convince you to buy a certain car or, choose a specific brand of soap, are actually operating in a constant, paralyzing state of fear?
Yeah, it's a completely fascinating paradox, isn't it? Because the billboards and the commercials, they project this absolute certainty, but the people who make them are often just terrified.
Right. And this brings up a question for you listening to this right now. Have you ever felt like an imposter at work?
Oh, I think everyone has at some point.
Exactly. Like, have you ever sat at your desk just staring at a blank screen, terrified that today is the day everyone figures out you have absolutely no idea what you're doing?
That is the exact feeling. And that feeling is actually the engine of the entire advertising industry.
It's wild to think about. But stick around, because today you're going to learn how to harness that exact anxiety to build a world-class team.
Because the outward projection of these companies is, all polish and swagger. But the internal reality of a creative enterprise is essentially managed panic.
Managed panic. I love that phrase.
It's true. You're asking people to conjure brilliance out of thin air on a strict deadline over and over again, and that creates a highly specific, highly volatile psychological environment.
So to understand how to actually survive and manage that volatility, today's deep dive takes us straight into Chapter 4 of David Ogilvy's legendary playbook, Ogilvy on Advertising.
Yes, specifically, we're focusing on his incredibly candid chapter called How to Run an Advertising Agency.
And look, whether you work in advertising or tech, consulting, or you're just trying to manage a team of human beings, you are going to discover the unvarnished truth about managing brilliant but fragile egos.
Because running an agency, or really any highly creative, high-stakes enterprise, isn't just about throwing beanbag chairs into a room and asking for good ideas.
Right, it's not just ping pong tables and free snacks.
No, not at all. It requires a profound understanding of structural psychology. You're managing human frailty just as much as you're managing a balance sheet.
You really need a genius for sustaining the morale of people who live in perpetual anxiety. And I want to focus on that anxiety first, because Ogilvy breaks down the fear in an agency into 3 distinct tiers.
Yeah, he paints a picture that sounds less like a modern workplace and more like a submarine operating at crush depth.
That's a great analogy. You have different people experiencing different types of pressure based on, well, where they're stationed on the sub.
Exactly. So let's examine the torpedo room first, right? The copywriter,
Uh-huh.
the creative mind.
Okay, the creatives. What's their specific fear?
Their fear is intensely personal, immediate, and inescapable. They live with the constant terror that they won't get a big idea before Tuesday morning.
Tuesday morning being the looming deadline.
Right. And let's say they do get an idea. The relief is only momentary because then they fear the client won't buy it or the focus group will hate it, or worst of all, it simply won't sell the product.
So it's just this endless cycle of dread. Even Ogilvy himself admitted he never sat down to write an advertisement without thinking, this time I'm going to fail.
Which is wild.
It is, coming from one of the most successful advertising minds in history. But I think it highlights the core issue with monetizing creativity. It is not an assembly line.
No, not at all. If you manage a factory that makes widgets, you know that if you pull the lever, a widget comes out. You can optimize the lever.
Right, but in knowledge work, the lever is the human brain. You can't force a brilliant slogan or a groundbreaking strategy to just materialize.
You really can't. So the copywriter is just terrified of the blank page. But then you have to ask, who is absorbing the pressure above them?
Okay, so moving up the submarine, who's next?
Above them, you have the account executive. They sit right in the middle. They are the bridge between the agency and the client, which basically means they serve as a professional shock absorber.
Oof, that sounds like a terrible position to be in.
It is. When the agency makes a mistake, say a typo in a national print run, the client holds the account executive responsible. They scream at the account executive.
But then what happens when the client is the one being unreasonable?
When the client is demanding a totally new campaign direction at the 11th hour, the creative team blames the account executive for not aggressively defending their work.
So they're caught in a perpetual crossfire, mistrusted by both sides.
Exactly. They get it from the creatives and they get it from the client.
Okay, which brings us to the bridge of this submarine, the CEO. If the creatives are worried about Tuesday's deadline, and the account execs are dodging bullets from both sides, what is keeping the CEO awake at night?
The CEO's fears are entirely existential. They aren't worried about typos. They're worrying about macroeconomic shifts, causing major clients to slash their budgets.
Right, the big picture stuff.
And worse, they're worrying about their best, most valuable partners secretly defecting to start their own rival agencies.
Oh, wow. And taking the best clients with them, I assume.
Exactly. Plus, they're terrified of making a hash out of a massive new business presentation that could literally determine whether the agency makes payroll next quarter.
So it's just a compounding structural dread from top to bottom.
It really is.
And honestly, this entire structure seems perfectly designed to breed resentment. Ogilvy uses an analogy that perfectly captures this structural bloat. Do you remember the dairy farmer one?
Oh, the cows and milkers, yes.
Right. He asks, like, if you were a dairy farmer, would you employ twice as many milkers as cows? Obviously, you wouldn't. You'd go bankrupt.
It makes absolutely no sense.
But in most agencies, they employ twice as many account executives as they do copywriters.
Yeah, you have an army of people essentially managing the very few people who are actually producing the core product.
Which has to create massive friction.
It creates endemic friction. The creatives look at the army of account executives and see a bureaucracy of brainless bullies who do nothing but water down their art to appease the client.
And the account executives, how do they view the creatives?
They look at the creatives and see irresponsible, fragile prima donnas who don't understand the realities of business.
Wow. So if the baseline reality of this business is structural friction and multi-layered panic, how does a manager keep everyone from just walking out the door?
Well, the natural instinct in corporate America today would be, implement a wellness program or schedule a mandatory mindfulness seminar.
Yeah, exactly. Bring in a yoga instructor on Fridays.
Right. But Ogilvy's solution is much more immediate and behavioral. He says you have to deliberately manufacture levity. His explicit rule is kill grimness with laughter.
Kill grimness with laughter.
Yes. You must encourage exuberance. You have to actively hunt down and remove the sad dogs who spread gloom around the office.
I have to say, I struggle with this a bit. Kill grimness with laughter sounds great on a motivational poster, but let's look at the actual lifestyle Ogilvy describes in this very same chapter.
It's intense.
Right. He mentions taking home 2 heavy briefcases of homework every single night. He talks about reading for 4 hours just to be prepared for the next day's client meetings.
And always being 25 return phone calls behind.
Exactly. If you are drowning in a sea of paperwork and unanswered calls, how do you spontaneously generate joy? Doesn't forced laughter just feel completely toxic?
Well, it feels toxic if the leader is demanding laughter while simultaneously offloading their stress onto the team.
Okay, so how does it actually work then?
The mechanism of killing grimness only works if the leader acts as an umbrella. The leader has to absorb that crushing workload, the briefcases, the unanswered calls, the existential dread, and completely shield the team from it.
So you carry the burden so your creatives feel safe enough to brainstorm.
Precisely. Laughter in a high-stress environment isn't about telling jokes. It's an indicator of psychological safety. When your people are operating in a state of high anxiety, levity is the pressure release valve. Without it, the engine blows.
Okay, that makes sense. The leader is basically acting as an emotional buffer. You are absorbing the terror of the market so your team can play in the sandbox.
That's a great way to put it.
But when everyone is working these intense hours, under this kind of subjective pressure where your worth is tied to your ideas, the human ego becomes incredibly fragile, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. People desperately need external validation.
And how does corporate America traditionally dispense validation when, budgets are tight?
It distributes titles and corner offices
Yeah.
and invitations to the executive dining room.
Right. The cheek stuff.
Exactly. Agencies, because of their hothouse atmosphere and the subjective nature of the work, are absolute breeding grounds for intense sibling rivalry.
And the title inflation Ogilvy describes is just staggering. I mean, he lists the actual hierarchy at his agency at the time, and it reads like a parody of corporate bloat.
It's hilarious. What were the numbers again?
Okay, get this. 2 chairmen, 3 presidents, 2 managing directors, 8 executive vice presidents, 67 senior vice presidents, and 249 vice presidents.
249 VPs. It is a definition of a perverse incentive structure.
Why do they do it?
Management resorts to handing out these titles because they're desperately trying to placate a horde of anxious, competitive egos. They think, if we just make Jim a vice president, he will stop complaining about his salary.
But the math of human envy basically guarantees that backfires.
Always. Every single time. Ogilvy quotes King Louis XIV to illustrate the psychological mechanism at play here.
Oh, the Louis quote. Every time I give someone a title, I make 100 people angry and 1 person ungrateful.
Yes. It's such a brilliant breakdown of human nature.
It really is. Because you make Jim a vice president to make him happy. But immediately, the 67 senior vice presidents are annoyed because the VP brand has been diluted.
Exactly.
And the person sitting next to Jim, who didn't get the title, is now furious, feeling publicly humiliated, and is probably updating their resume right there.
You've solved one temporary ego problem and created a dozen permanent ones.
So what's the underlying takeaway for the listener here, anyone managing a team?
The takeaway is that artificial hierarchy cannot solve psychological insecurity. You cannot fix rivalry with a plaque on a door.
So what do you do instead?
Instead, Ogilvy references Dr. William Menninger, who suggested that the executive is inevitably a father figure and must manage through a psychological lens.
Now, I have to push back on this framing just a little bit.
Yeah.
The nurturing father figure concept feels a bit paternalistic, maybe even archaic for a modern workforce.
I get that.
Like, does a manager today really want to view their highly skilled adult employees as squabbling siblings that need a father?
It is a provocative framing, for sure. But look past the gendered language of the 1960s and examine the psychological dynamic Menninger is actually pointing to.
Okay, unpack that dynamic for me.
In any closed system where a central authority distributes resources, whether that resource is money, praise, or promotions, the subordinates will naturally regress into sibling rivalry.
You start looking at who the parent favors.
Exactly. They watch each other constantly. So the solution isn't to literally treat them like children. The solution is absolute, unyielding fairness.
Fairness.
Yes. If you play favorites, you pour gasoline on the rivalry. If you are deeply fair, objective, and refuse to engage in the drama, you calm the anxieties that cause the rivalry in the first place.
Okay, that reframing makes it much more applicable. You aren't their parent, but you are the arbiter of fairness in a system that naturally wants to eat itself.
Exactly right.
But managing these fragile egos is basically impossible if you don't hire the right raw material in the first place, right? You need an incredibly rigorous filter at the front door.
Success in any knowledge-based business depends entirely on your ability to hire exceptional talent, train them, and maximize their potential.
So what exactly was Ogilvy looking for?
He sought out what J.P. Morgan called gentlemen with brains.
Okay, let's unpack gentlemen with brains, because it sounds like he's just looking for, aristocratic prep school graduates.
It does sound like that, but he was actually looking for the opposite of a narrow specialist. He wanted people with well-furnished minds.
A well-furnished mind.
Yes, people who exhibit immense curiosity about every subject under the sun. They need common sense, wisdom, imagination, and crucially, an incredibly high degree of literacy.
The emphasis on literacy is actually really surprising for an industry we mostly associate with visual flair, fast-talking pitches and catchy jingles. Why is writing the ultimate metric for an ad executive?
Because the vast majority of communication between an agency and a client isn't a glamorous pitch, it's written documentation.
Like emails or memos.
Exactly. Memoranda, strategy documents, policy papers, creative briefs. Writing is simply thought made visible.
Thought made visible. I like that.
If a candidate cannot write lucidly, it means they cannot think lucidly. A disorganized memo reveals a disorganized mind.
So you filter for extreme curiosity and lucid writing, but there is a massive psychological hurdle that managers face when actually pulling the trigger on a hire.
And Ogilvy illustrates how to overcome this with a fantastic visual analogy.
Yes, the Matryoshka strategy.
Right. So, whenever a new head of an office was appointed in the Ogilvy network, they would receive a Russian Matryoshka doll from Gorky.
For the listener, that's the wooden nesting dolls.
Exactly. You open the large wooden doll, and there is a slightly smaller one inside, and you keep unpacking them until you reach the tiny solid wooden figure in the center.
And what was the point of sending a toy to a new executive?
Inside the very smallest doll, Ogilvy hid a written message.
What did it say?
It read, "If each of us hires people who are smaller than we are, we shall become a company of dwarfs. But if each of us hires people who are bigger than we are, we will become a company of giants."
Man, it is a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
But practically speaking, it goes against almost every biological instinct of survival in corporate management.
Oh, completely.
If I'm an office manager, and I'm already feeling that imposter syndrome we talked about at the start, my instinct is to hire someone smaller than me.
Because it feels safer.
Right. I want to hire someone competent enough to do the work, but not so brilliant that they make me look obsolete or, threaten my job. How does a company actually convince its managers to act against their own self-interest and hire giants?
It requires a culture that explicitly rewards secure leadership over individual brilliance. You have to evaluate managers not on how smart they are, but on how smart the people under them are.
That demands supreme confidence.
It does. You must actively seek out people who are smarter, more talented, and more capable than you are, and accept the uncomfortable reality that they might outshine you.
And the hiring philosophy also dictates strict rules on who you must avoid at all costs, right?
Yes. The do not hire list is ruthlessly pragmatic. First, never hire your friends.
That's a tough one for a lot of people.
It is, but Ogilvy admits he made this mistake 3 times, had to fire all 3 when they underperformed, and lost the friendships forever.
When a business requires uncompromising standards, personal affection just clouds your judgment.
Exactly. You'll tolerate mediocrity in a friend that you would instantly fire in a stranger. It's human nature.
And the second rule is equally pragmatic.
Yeah.
Never hire your clients' children or spouses.
It's just an obvious trap.
Right. If the client's kid is incompetent, you eventually have to fire them. And the moment you fire the kid,
You lose the multi-million-dollar client.
it's a complete no-win scenario.
Yeah.
But let's imagine you follow all the rules. You hire brilliant, literate giants. You avoid your friends. You have a team of superstars. What happens to the absolute best talent in the system?
This is where we encounter one of the most destructive structural flaws in modern business. It's a variation of the Peter Principle.
Okay, explain that for us.
The best practitioners, the most brilliant copywriters, the visionary art directors inevitably get promoted into management.
And we all know why that happens. The corporate structure really only has one mechanism for rewarding excellence: climbing the ladder.
Right.
If I'm the best copywriter in the world, the only way I can get a massive pay raise and more status is to become the creative director.
Exactly. But the skill set required to write a transcendent advertisement has absolutely zero overlap with the skill set required to manage 50 anxious employees, balance a departmental budget, and navigate corporate bureaucracy.
They're 2 completely different jobs.
Entirely different. Once that brilliant copywriter is in management, they're no longer doing the thing that made them valuable to the agency in the first place.
They're sitting in meetings dealing with the 249 vice presidents.
Yes. It is a terrible waste of specific talent, driven entirely by a flawed compensation structure.
So you've gathered all these brilliant, high-ego giants. Some of them are miscast in management. All of them are stressed. You put them in a confined space. Inevitably, the political maneuvering begins.
It's unavoidable.
How do you stop a company from just tearing itself apart from the inside?
You have to act with brutal, almost dictatorial swiftness to squelch office politics. Ogilvy describes the environment as a hothouse atmosphere.
A hothouse. That sounds suffocating.
It is, when you combine high stakes, fragile egos, and highly subjective work, where the difference between a good idea and a bad idea is essentially just opinion. It causes outbreaks of psychological warfare.
He actually cites the Milton Bio Agency, didn't he?
Yes, an agency that was completely torn apart by vicious internal politics and ultimately had to close its doors. It destroyed the company.
So Ogilvy lists several methods for crushing this political behavior, and they're fascinating because they are so aggressive.
Very aggressive. He tells managers to identify and fire the worst politicians immediately.
But how do you spot the invisible political operator? They're usually pretty sneaky.
Ogilvy says you look at the paper trail. You look for the person who constantly sends blind copied poison pen memos.
Ah, the BCC.
The blind carbon copy is the weapon of the corporate coward. It allows someone to attack a colleague's reputation while maintaining plausible deniability to their face.
That's so toxic.
The leader must view that kind of covert communication not as keeping the boss in the loop, but as a terminal cancer in the agency's culture.
Now, my absolute favorite tactic he outlines for dealing with back-channeling is almost terrifying in its directness.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
When an employee comes into your office and starts whispering complaints about a rival, trying to subtly undermine them, what does Ogilvy do?
He doesn't nod and listen. He immediately picks up the telephone, summons the accused rival into the office right that second, and forces the person who was just whispering to repeat their accusation out loud directly to the rival's face.
I want you to imagine the sheer, visceral panic of being the person complaining.
It would be horrifying.
You think you're having a private, strategic conversation with the boss. Suddenly the door opens, the person you are trashing walks in, and the boss says, "Please repeat what you were just telling me."
It is a nightmare scenario.
But look at the psychological mechanics of why it works. It completely neutralizes the power of the back channel.
Because office politics rely on the shadows. They rely on the assumption of secrecy. By bringing the accused into the light immediately, you make political maneuvering incredibly uncomfortable, socially awkward, and professionally risky.
It forces absolute transparency.
Yes. He also advocates for a crusade against paper warfare in general. He forces people to settle their disputes face to face.
It's the same psychological principle. Distance breeds courage. People will type vicious, uncompromising things in an email that they would never have the audacity to say while looking a colleague in the eye.
Exactly. He also instituted internal luncheon clubs, which, seems like a quaint relic, but it serves a vital purpose.
How so?
If you sit down and break bread with a colleague, and you ask about their children or their mobbies, you build a foundation of human empathy.
It's significantly harder to actively sabotage someone's career if you know the names of their kids.
Right. It turns an abstract obstacle into a human being.
The ultimate lesson for the listener here is that a leader cannot indulge in the dark arts of management. You can't play favorites, you can't encourage internal poaching, and you must absolutely never use the tactic of divide and conquer.
Right. Divide et impera.
Yeah.
It's tempting for insecure leaders to pit factions against each other because it ensures the leader remains the ultimate arbiter of power.
But it just creates a paranoid, low-trust environment where the energy is spent on survival rather than on creating brilliant work for the client.
Exactly.
So you've survived the gauntlet, you've hired giants, you've neutralized the toxic politics, and you've forced everyone to look each other in the eye. Now you actually have to do the work.
And this brings us to the concept of discipline and the profound burden of leadership.
Because once the interpersonal noise is cleared away, you are left with the reality of the work itself. And that work requires unremitting pressure on professional standards.
We tend to romanticize creative environments as, loose bohemian places where inspiration strikes at the ping pong table.
Right.
But Ogilvy shatters that illusion. He demanded rigorous, almost militaristic discipline.
It feels entirely counterintuitive. You want free-thinking artists, but you demand they act like accountants. For instance, he was obsessed with punctuality. He even suggested paying a financial bonus simply to get people to arrive at the office on time.
Punctuality in a collaborative environment isn't about control. It's a proxy for respect.
How do you mean?
If a meeting starts 15 minutes late, you're stealing 15 minutes of focus from every other giant in the room. You're wasting their time.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
He also insisted on intense paranoid secrecy regarding client information. He specifically warned against the casual habit of gossiping in elevators.
Think about how easily that happens. Two executives get into an elevator going down to the lobby. They casually complain about how hard it is to launch client X's new, highly classified product next month.
They don't realize a journalist or a competitor or an investor is standing right behind them.
Exactly. A careless word in a public space can destroy a multi-million-dollar campaign.
But enforcing these exacting standards requires a specific caliber of leader. And Ogilvy makes a brilliant distinction here between a good problem solver and a true leader.
Yes. Most executives who climb the ranks are simply good problem solvers. They know how to fix a broken supply chain or untangle a budget.
But true leaders are vanishingly rare.
A problem solver fixes what is broken. A leader elevates the capacity of the people around them.
He notes that true leaders inspire their lieutenants. They don't castrate them. They don't hoard authority. They distribute it.
And they don't necessarily look like central casting's idea of a CEO.
Right. Corporations have a terrible habit of rejecting executives who don't fit the conventional mold. But great leaders are often mavericks, eccentrics, or nonconformists.
Ogilvy points out that he himself was an unemployed farmer, a former cook in Paris, and a university dropout when he started his agency. Pedigree is completely irrelevant.
The only metric that matters is whether an individual naturally creates a center of leadership around them.
And crucially, a great leader requires great followers.
Yes. There is a historical anecdote in the text that Ogilvy uses to define the ultimate state of a high-functioning team. It involves General Cadogan and the Duke of Marlborough.
This perfectly illustrates the concept of anticipatory followership.
Set the scene for us.
On the night before a major battle, the Duke of Marlborough and his staff were reconnoitering the terrain on horseback. Marlborough drops his glove on the ground. General Cadogan, his chief of staff, dismounts, picks up the glove, and hands it back to him. The rest of the officers think this is just a polite, deferential gesture.
Just picking up the boss's glove.
Right. Later that evening, Marlborough issues his final order. Cadogan, put a battery of guns where I dropped my glove.
And what does Cadogan say?
Cadogan replies, I have already done so.
It is an incredible story. Cadogan didn't wait for the explicit command. He understood the strategic mind of his leader so intimately that the simple act of a dropped glove communicated a complex tactical deployment.
That is the ultimate goal of a well-disciplined team. Leadership isn't about barking micromanaged order.
It's about setting a vision so clear and training your team so thoroughly that they anticipate the needs of the business before the words are even spoken.
Exactly. A true leader leaves their team with a feeling of absolute uplift and confidence after every single interaction.
But projecting that unyielding confidence while absorbing all the anxiety we discussed earlier, that takes a brutal physical and psychological toll on the leaders themselves.
It does. And the text doesn't shy away from the dark reality of what this pressure does to human beings.
It's a profoundly sobering section of the book. Ogilvy notes that at the time, it was reliably reported that 7 out of every 100 executives in American business were alcoholics.
And he assumes the proportion in an advertising agency is at least as high, if not significantly higher.
We discussed the intense anxiety of the copywriter and the CEO at the beginning. It's obvious why alcoholism becomes prevalent. Alcohol is a fast-acting, incredibly effective, and ultimately destructive tool for self-medicating panic.
It quiets the noise.
And the damage goes far beyond substance abuse, right?
He cites a study revealing that the death rate from stress-related causes like heart attacks, strokes, is 14% higher among senior advertising executives than their counterparts in other white-collar occupations.
14% higher. That is a staggering mortality statistic.
It completely strips away the Mad Men illusion of advertising as a fun, glamorous playground of long lunches and witty banter.
It's a high-stakes crucible that literally breaks people.
Which is precisely why the discipline, the strict rules against politics, and the mandate to kill grimness with laughter are so vital.
They aren't just arbitrary corporate rules.
No, they are the guardrails keeping people from driving their psychological health right off a cliff.
Wow. We have spent a lot of time exploring the psychology, the brutal politics, the hiring strategies, and the heavy burden of leadership. But absolutely none of this matters if the underlying business model is fundamentally broken.
That's true.
I want to pivot and look at the actual economics of running an agency. Because when I read the financial breakdown in this chapter, it completely rewired my understanding of the industry.
It is perhaps the greatest illusion in modern business. From the outside, the advertising industry looks like a fountain of limitless wealth.
You see massive Super Bowl budgets, television shoots in exotic locations, lavish client dinners. The top-line revenue is massive.
But top-line revenue is vanity.
The actual profit margins, the money the agency actually gets to keep, are shockingly terrible. Ogilvy notes that the average profit of an American agency after taxes is less than 1%.
Less than 1%. Specifically, in 1981, it was 0.83% of billing. That is less than 1 penny on the dollar.
It creates a razor-thin margin for error that dictates every single operational decision. You are walking a tightrope between bankruptcy and client dissatisfaction.
It requires an incredibly delicate balancing act regarding how you service your accounts.
Let's walk through that tightrope. If an agency wants to artificially inflate that tiny profit margin, the temptation is to chisel on service.
Right. And chiseling means you start cutting corners. Instead of putting 3 senior strategists on a client's account, you put 1 junior employee.
Or instead of paying for a massive comprehensive research study to understand the consumer, you just guess.
Exactly. If you do this, your expenses drop and your profit margin temporarily spikes. But the client isn't stupid. They notice the drop in quality, the creative work suffers, and eventually they fire you.
So the natural reaction then is to overcorrect. You want to make sure the client never fires you, so you overservice them.
You give them a 177-page data analysis when a simple 5-page summary memo would have sufficed, just to prove how hard you are working.
You fly 10 executives to a meeting that only required 2.
Yes, the client absolutely loves you because they are getting a massive amount of free labor.
Oh.
But you go broke because you have spent all your potential profit on unbillable man-hours.
You have to find the exact, hyper-efficient middle ground,
Yeah.
world-class service delivered with zero wasted motion.
A huge part of this economic puzzle, and a major source of historical friction in the industry, is the underlying mechanism of how the agency actually gets paid.
Ogilvy spends significant time discussing the structural shift from the traditional commission system to the fee system. Can we break down exactly how the old commission model worked and why it was so problematic?
Historically, agencies operated on a 15% commission system established by the media owners. Let's create a hypothetical scenario to see the mechanics.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Suppose an agency creates a television commercial for a car company. The agency goes to a television network and buys $10 million worth of airtime to broadcast that commercial. The television network, as a standard practice, would pay the agency a 15% commission for bringing them the business.
So the agency makes $1.5 million.
Exactly.
The conflict of interest there is glaringly obvious. If I am the client and my agency tells me, we've run the analysis and you need to spend an extra $20 million on television ads this quarter, I have to question their motives.
Are they recommending this because it's genuinely the best strategy to sell my cars? Or are they recommending it because they want to pocket a cool $3 million in commission?
Right. The agency is financially incentivized to tell the client to spend as much money as possible, regardless of efficacy.
It is a structurally perverse incentive. The agency's income is tied entirely to the volume of the client spending, not the success of the advertising.
Furthermore, it creates massive internal imbalances.
Oh, totally. A client who spends $50 million on simple, easy-to-place network TV buys generates massive revenue for the agency with very little labor required.
Meanwhile, a client who spends $2 million on highly complex localized print and radio ads requires an enormous amount of labor to execute, but generates very little commission.
So the easy, high-spending client is secretly subsidizing the complex, low-spending client.
This is why Ogilvy became a massive champion of the fee system. Under the fee system, you strip away the commission entirely.
The client simply pays a set, negotiated fee for the agency's intellectual labor and services, regardless of how much media or airtime they end up buying.
The fee system introduces logic and transparency to the economics. Ogilvy outlines 4 massive structural advantages to this approach. Let's hit those.
First, the client pays for exactly what they want, no more, no less. It operates like a traditional consulting model.
Second, every account pays its own way. You eliminate the hidden subsidies. If a complex account requires hundreds of hours of labor, the fee reflects that reality.
Third, it provides the agency with desperately needed stability. Under the commission system, if a client experiences a bad quarter and suddenly slashes their advertising budget by 50%, the agency's income drops by 50% overnight.
And they are forced to immediately lay off staff.
Exactly. A contracted fee provides a stable revenue floor protecting the workers.
And fourth, which is the most critical for the long-term relationship, it completely eliminates the conflict of interest. When an agency on a fee system recommends that a client increase their media spend, the client knows the advice is objective.
They know the agency isn't just trying to line its own pockets, because the agency's fee remains exactly the same whether the client spends $10 or $10 million. It replaces suspicion with absolute trust.
But even with the stability of a fee system, the margins remain incredibly tight. This leads to a crucial operational lesson for any business owner chasing scale. Size does not equal profit.
Top-line revenue, the vanity metric of how much money is flowing through the building, is utterly meaningless if the bottom-line reality is bleeding cash.
Ogilvy points out the stark reality that his agency made more actual profit than a rival agency that built twice as much volume.
So if you manage this impossible tightrope and you actually carve out a fraction of a percent in profit, what do you do with that cash? You don't just sit on it.
You must reinvest it back into the business, but you must do so with extreme caution. Ogilvy suggests three safe avenues for deploying profit. First, you open branch offices in other cities or countries, but you build them from scratch.
You send your own people to establish the beachhead, ensuring your specific culture is preserved rather than inheriting a mess.
Second, he suggests buying the building that houses your office, which makes sense. You convert an endless operational expense, rent, into a tangible, appreciating asset.
And third, you build a massive reserve fund against a rainy day because in a subjective, client-driven business, the rain is always coming.
But he includes a very specific warning regarding what you should not do with your profits. He warns against buying other established agencies.
Why? Isn't acquisition the fastest way to scale a business?
On paper, yes. But agencies are essentially just collections of volatile human psychology. They are seldom up for sale unless they are already in some kind of deep structural trouble.
And even if they aren't in trouble, the friction of trying to merge two completely different creative cultures with different egos and different standards is often abominable.
You spend all your time managing the resentment of the acquired staff instead of serving the clients.
I have to take a step back here. We have outlined an industry with sub 1% margins, an industry where the stress physically destroys the executives at a rate 14% higher than average.
An industry plagued by infantile ego battles, structural paranoia, and constant client demands. Why on earth would anyone with capital choose to invest in this business model?
It is the ultimate question, and to answer it, Ogilvy brings in the perspective of one of the most pragmatic, ruthless capital allocators in history, Warren Buffett.
Buffett actually took substantial equity positions in several publicly held advertising agencies. Why would the Oracle of Omaha buy into this chaos?
Because, as Buffett realized, an agency acts as a royalty on the growth of others.
A royalty on the growth of others. That is a brilliant way to frame intellectual capital. Let's compare it to traditional industry.
If you want to build a business that makes cars, you have to spend billions of dollars building a physical factory. You have to buy steel, manage a massive physical supply chain, and deal with complex manufacturing logistics. It is wildly capital intensive.
Exactly. But an ad agency requires virtually no capital. You don't build the factories, you don't manufacture the cars, you don't ship the soap.
Your only inventory goes up and down the elevator every day.
If you write a brilliant campaign that helps the car company double its sales, you share in that massive financial upside simply by providing the ideas that fueled the growth. When it works, it is the most capital-efficient business model on earth. You are monetizing pure thought.
But as we have spent the last hour discussing, managing the fragile humans who produce those thoughts is an agonizingly difficult task. We've covered a massive expanse of psychological and economic terrain today.
How do we synthesize all of these moving parts into a singular understanding of what it takes to run a creative enterprise?
If we distill this entire chapter down to its absolute core, it is this. Running an agency or any high-level knowledge business is a masterclass in managing extreme contradictions.
Contradictions. Let's trace those because they really define the entire ecosystem.
You must hire brilliant, highly literate, anxiety-riddled giants who are terrified of failing. But simultaneously, you must enforce a ruthless, almost militaristic discipline upon them regarding punctuality and secrecy.
You must operate in a high-stakes, stressful environment where the loss of a client could mean mass layoffs, but you must actively and deliberately kill the grimness of that reality with laughter and exuberance.
You must maintain pristine, uncompromising professional standards of client service while operating on a razor-thin sub 1% profit margin that leaves zero room for error.
You are essentially building an incredibly rigid, heavy-duty container so that the volatile, unpredictable chemistry of human creativity can safely explode inside it without blowing up the entire company.
That is the perfect mechanical analogy. The soul of this chapter is the realization that creative success isn't born from chaos or a lack of rules or unchecked freedom.
True, scalable creative success is actually the product of intense, empathetic, and highly disciplined management.
It changes the way you look at the creative industries entirely. Before we wrap up, Ogilvy leaves us with two final, highly actionable management rules at the very end of this chapter. These aren't abstract theories. These are things you, the listener, can apply to your own workday tomorrow morning.
Yes, two incredibly simple, deceptively powerful rules regarding human behavior. First, never allow two people to do a job that one person could do.
He quotes George Washington to drive this home, which shows how universal this problem is.
Washington observed that whenever one person is assigned a specific duty, they apply themselves to it with focus. But if two people share the duty, it is worse executed.
And if three or more are assigned to the same task, it is scarcely done at all. The diffusion of responsibility guarantees mediocrity.
When everyone is responsible, absolutely no one is responsible.
It's the death by committee. If you want something done well, give it to one giant and hold them accountable. And the second rule is about physical space and authority.
The rule is, never summon people to your office. It frightens them. Instead, you must go to them, unannounced, in their own offices.
This circles all the way back to the anxiety we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive. If the CEO's assistant calls a copywriter and says, the boss needs to see you in his office, that copywriter spends the entire agonizing walk down the hallway convinced they are about to be fired.
Their heart rate spikes, their defenses go up, and by the time they sit in the chair, they are in a state of fight or flight.
Precisely. You cannot have a productive, creative conversation with an employee who is in a state of panic. By leaving your desk and going to their workspace, you lower their defenses.
You interact with them in their own elements, surrounded by their own work. More importantly, it prevents the leader from becoming an invisible, isolated hermit locked in an ivory tower, disconnected from the actual energy of the floor.
So ask yourself, listening to this right now, look at your calendar for the past week. How many meetings or email chains did you have that violated those two simple rules?
How many times did you assign a task to a cross-functional committee instead of empowering a single individual to execute it? How many times did you make a subordinate walk to your desk or join your Zoom link instead of stepping into their environment?
It is these.
In our next deep dive, we're going to uncover the tactical secrets of hunting down and landing the clients of your dreams. Until then, remember that the people projecting the most absolute confidence are often fighting the hardest internal battles, and that managed anxiety might just be their secret weapon.
What you just listened was the beginning of a full audio, way longer, explaining every single chapter of the book. If you would like to keep listening to the end and access to the full audio, you can access it with the link down below in the description and in the pinned comment.